Chapter 1. The Architect's Shadow. There are few moments in the grim annals of the Great Crusade more bitter than those that followed the humiliation of Monarchia. The perfect city lay in ruins, its golden spires reduced to ash and memory by the Emperor's own hand. The Word-bearers' legion, once the most fervent in their devotion, now bore the weight of their father's displeasure like chains upon their souls. Yet in that darkness, in the depths of shame and wounded pride, seeds of something far more terrible than rebellion began to take root. Erebus stood upon the observation deck of the Fidelitas Lex, gazing down at the smouldering remains of the world below. The flames that had consumed Monarchia still flickered in the distance, casting dancing shadows across his pale features. He was a figure of quiet authority among the Word-bearers, their first chaplain, keeper of the Legion's spiritual well-being. But beneath the facade of righteous grief that he wore so expertly, something far older and more malevolent stirred. The humiliation of Monarchia had been a gift, though none among his brothers could see it yet. The Emperor's rebuke had cracked the foundation of Lorgar's faith, creating fissures that could be widened, exploited, turned to darker purposes. For Erebus had walked in shadow long before he had donned the grey of the Word-bearers. He had knelt before altars that predated the Imperium, whispered names that no loyal servant of the Emperor should know. First Chaplain. The voice belonged to Lorgar, his Primarch, the golden son who now seemed diminished by sorrow. Lorgar approached with the measured steps of one bearing an unbearable weight. His eyes, once bright with zealous purpose, had grown hollow since Monarchia's fall. "My lord?" Erebus turned, offering the reverent bow that protocol demanded, yet his mind raced with possibilities. The moment was ripe, the wound fresh and bleeding. The flames of Monarchia burn still, as does the injustice done to you and your sons. Lorgar's jaw tightened. The Emperor's words echoed in the silence between them, the crushing verdict that had reduced a lifetime of devotion to error and excess. We were told our faith was misplaced, that our worship was unwanted. And yet faith is eternal, Erebus replied, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. Perhaps the object of our devotion was misplaced, not the devotion itself. Perhaps there are other gods in this galaxy, entities more deserving of the reverence you have shown. The words hung in the air like poison, sweet and intoxicating. Lorgar's eyes flickered with something that might have been hope, or might have been desperation. Erebus watched carefully, measuring his Primarch's reaction, calculating how much pressure the wound could bear before it shattered entirely. "Speak plainly, Erebus. What gods do you mean?" "Ancient ones, my lord. Powers that ruled the stars when mankind was young, that shaped the warp itself according to their will. They have watched our crusade with interest, witnessed your faith and found it pure. Where the Emperor saw excess, they see potential. Where he demanded silence, they offer communion. It was blasphemy of the highest order, treason dressed in the language of salvation. Yet Lorgar did not recoil. Instead, he leaned closer, drawn by the promise of purpose in a universe that had suddenly seemed empty of meaning. "Tell me more of these gods." Erebus smiled, though he kept the expression hidden in the shadows cast by his hood. The first stone had been cast, the first crack opened in the dam that held back the flood. "Tonight, my lord, when the ship sleeps, and the only witnesses are the stars themselves, there are rites to be observed, words to be spoken. The gods are patient, but they do not wait forever." Miles away, in the depths of the Fidelitas Lex, Argel Tal made his way through corridors that had once rung with prayers to the Emperor. Now they echoed with whispered conversations and furtive glances. Something had changed aboard the flagship since Monarchia, a subtle shift in the Legion's spirit that set his teeth on edge. As a chaplain of the Word-bearers, he had been trained to recognize the signs of spiritual corruption. But this was different, harder to define. The warrior lodges had grown more secretive, their meetings held in sealed chambers far from the ship's command sections. Brothers who had once spoken freely of their faith now gathered in hushed circles, sharing words in languages that predated Imperial Gothic. Argyll Tal had tried to dismiss it as grief, the natural response of faithful men whose devotion had been rejected. But tonight, something urged him to investigate further. He paused outside a sealed bulkhead deep in the ship's belly, one that should have been empty storage space. Yet light leaked from beneath the door, and voices murmured within. Not the voices of his brothers discussing scripture or strategy, but something else entirely. Something that made the air itself feel thick and wrong. Carefully, Argyll Tal activated his helmet's Auspex array, scanning through the bulkhead. What he saw within made his blood run cold. Erebus knelt at the center of a circle, drawn in what looked like blood, surrounded by a dozen word-bearers whose faces were hidden beneath ritual masks. Symbols covered the walls, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than the human eye could process. And the words they spoke, the litany that rose from their throats like smoke, was in no language taught in the archives of terror. It was older, deeper, carrying harmonics that resonated not with the ear, but with something darker within the soul. Argyll Tal watched in growing horror as his first chaplain, the keeper of their legion's faith, prostrated himself before an altar that bore no resemblance to any imperial iconography. The ritual was an abomination, a mockery of everything the word-bearers had once stood for. Yet Erebus led it with the same fervor he had once shown in praise of the Emperor. The truth hit him like a physical blow. This was not grief driving his brothers to new forms of worship. This was corruption, pure and simple. Erebus had been touched by something foul, something that sought to poison the entire legion through him. The humiliation of Monarchia had not broken the word-bearers' faith. It had simply redirected it toward masters far worse than any they had known. Argyll Tal backed away from the bulkhead, his mind racing. Who could he trust with this knowledge? How far had the corruption spread? And most importantly, how could he stop it before it consumed not just Erebus, but Lorgar himself? Within the ritual chamber, Erebus raised his head as if sensing scrutiny. His eyes swept the walls, searching for something he could not quite identify. The sensation of being watched prickled at the edge of his consciousness, a warning that his carefully laid plans might be in danger. "Continue the ritual," he commanded his followers, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no question. But privately, he began to consider what measures might be necessary to protect his work. The corruption of Lorgar was proceeding perfectly, but if there were those among the Legion who might interfere, they would need to be dealt with. The gods demanded sacrifice, after all, and Erebus had never been one to disappoint his masters. The flames of Monarchia had been extinguished, but in their ashes, a far darker fire had begun to burn. The word-bearers stood at a crossroads, though most did not yet realize it. The path Erebus offered led to power beyond imagination, but it also led to damnation for every soul who walked it. Yet in the shadows of the ship's corridors, one loyal son of Lorgar had seen the truth. The question now was whether Argyll Tal could act upon that knowledge before the architect of corruption completed his design. The fate of not just the word-bearers, but perhaps the entire galaxy, hung in the balance. For Erebus was patient, cunning, and utterly without conscience in pursuit of his goals. And he had already begun to suspect that someone was watching. Chapter 2. The Crimson King's Doubt. The warp was a sea of souls, vast and tempestuous, where the thoughts and dreams of mortals swirled like currents beneath an endless storm. Magnus the Red had sailed these ethereal waters for decades, navigating by the light of his own psychic mastery. Yet lately, something had begun to trouble the depths. Disturbances rippled outward from coordinates that corresponded to the word-bearer's fleet positions, anomalies that carried the taste of something ancient and malevolent. From his meditation chamber aboard the Photep, flagship of the Thousand Suns, Magnus cast his consciousness into the immaterium once more. The ritual circle beneath him blazed with carefully inscribed wards, each symbol a safeguard against the predators that lurked in the warp's darker regions. His crimson skin gleamed with perspiration as his single eye rolled back, revealing only white, and his spirit slipped free of mortal flesh. The sensation was one of liberation, of casting off the chains of physical existence to soar among the stars themselves. Here, in the realm of pure thought and emotion, Magnus was more than a primarch. He was a god of knowledge, a master of forces that most of his brothers could barely comprehend. Yet even gods could know unease, and what he sensed now filled him with a dread he had not felt since his earliest explorations of the warp's mysteries. The disturbances emanated from Lorgar's fleet like ripples from a stone cast into still water. But these were not the gentle emanations of prayer and devotion that had once characterized his brother's legion. Instead, they carried harmonics of something far older, deeper, touched with frequencies that made the very fabric of reality shiver in response. Magnus had encountered such emanations before, in the deepest reaches of the warp where sanity itself became a fragile concept. His consciousness recoiled from direct contact with the source, recognizing danger even as curiosity urged him forward. This was not mere psychic turbulence caused by the emotional upheaval of Monarchia's destruction. This was deliberate, controlled, the product of minds that had learned to shape the warp according to darker purposes. Magnus pulled his awareness back to his physical form, the meditation chamber reforming around him, like a dream made solid. His breathing was labored, his massive frame trembling with the effort of maintaining connection across such vast distances while avoiding detection. The taste of brass and sulfur lingered in his psychic senses, flavors that had no place in the clean halls of his flagship. "My lord?" The voice belonged to Azek Ahriman, chief librarian of the Thousand Suns, a warrior scholar whose mastery of the psychic arts was exceeded only by Magnus himself. Ahriman stood at the chamber's threshold, his ornate armor gleaming in the ritual circle's dying light. "You appear troubled." Magnus rose from the circle, his towering frame casting long shadows across the chamber's walls. "Trouble does not begin to encompass what I have witnessed, my son. Something stirs within our brother Lorgar's fleet, something that should not exist in any realm claimed by the Emperor's light." Ahriman stepped forward, concern etched across his scarred features. Of all the Thousand Suns, he alone possessed the psychic sensitivity to understand the true scope of what Magnus had experienced. What manner of disturbance? The warp has been turbulent since Monarchia's destruction, but that is to be expected, given the emotional trauma inflicted upon the word-bearers. "This transcends mere emotional resonance," Magnus replied, moving to the chamber's viewing port where the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns. "I have detected emanations that speak of deliberate manipulation, of minds that have learned to commune with forces that predate human civilization. The taste of it is familiar, yet I cannot place where I have encountered such darkness before. The implications hung between them, like a sword suspended by a single thread. Both Primarch and Astartes understood the dangers that lurked in the warp's depths, the entities that fed upon psychic energy and sought constantly to break through into realm. If someone aboard Lorgar's flagship had made contact with such beings, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for the word-bearers, but for the entire Imperium. "Have you attempted direct communication with the Primarch Lorgar?" Ahriman asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "I have tried," Magnus admitted, frustration coloring his words. "Each attempt encounters interference, as if something is deliberately blocking my efforts to reach my brother's mind. This is not the natural psychic dampening that occurs over vast distances. Nor is it the simple reluctance of a grieving soul to accept contact. Something actively opposes my attempts at communion." Magnus turned from the viewing port, his single eye blazing with determination that had driven him to unlock the secrets of the universe itself. "Prepare the Sekhmet Terminators for potential deployment. Alert our fastest escort vessels, and have them ready for immediate warp translation. If my fears prove correct, we may need to intervene before whatever darkness has taken root in Lorgar's fleet can spread further." "You believe the threat is immediate?" Ahriman's hand moved instinctively to the force weapon at his side, a gesture born of countless battles against entities that could not be fought with conventional means. "I believe," Magnus said slowly, weighing each word like a gravestone, "that we are witnessing the first moves in a game whose rules we do not yet understand. But the players on the opposing side are ancient beyond measure, and their victory would mean the end of everything the Emperor has built." Miles away across the void, aboard the word-bearer's flagship Fidelitas Lex, Erebus felt the gentle pressure of psychic scrutiny like fingers brushing against his consciousness. His meditation chamber was smaller than Magnus's grand ritual space, more intimate, filled with symbols that would have made any loyal servant of the Imperium recoil in horror. Yet to Erebus, they were beautiful, perfect expressions of truths that transcended the narrow limitations of imperial doctrine. The probe was subtle, expertly crafted, bearing the unmistakable psychic signature of the Crimson King himself. Magnus the Red, the Emperor's most gifted psyker, was taking an interest in the word-bearer's spiritual awakening. This was both dangerous and inevitable. Of all the Primarchs, Magnus possessed the sensitivity to detect the changes that had begun to manifest aboard the fleet. Erebus smiled as he wove a counter-probe of his own, not seeking to attack or expose Magnus's surveillance, but rather to deflect it, to create the psychic equivalent of a hall of mirrors where every attempt to penetrate deeper would encounter only reflections and false images. The technique was ancient, learned from texts that had been old when mankind first looked up at the stars with wonder. The deflection held, turning Magnus's psychic touch aside without alerting him to the true nature of the interference. To the Thousand Suns Primarch, it would seem like natural warp turbulence, the kind of psychic static that occurred during emotionally charged periods. Yet Erebus knew this reprieve was temporary. Magnus was persistent, and his suspicions, once aroused, would not be easily satisfied. "You grow bold, Crimson King," Erebus whispered to the shadows that danced at the edge of his vision, entities that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare. "But boldness without wisdom leads only to damnation, and you are far closer to that precipice than you know." The ritual chamber fell silent, except for the low humming of the ship's engines and the whispered prayers of the corrupted word-bearers who knelt in the corridors beyond. Erebus had work to do, plans to accelerate, and now he had the added pressure of knowing that one of the most dangerous minds in the galaxy was beginning to take notice of his activities. Yet this too could be turned to advantage. Magnus's investigation might provide the very catalyst needed to push Lorgar over the edge into full acceptance of the gods' gifts. Nothing motivated a Primarch quite like the threat of external interference in their legion's affairs. Erebus rose from his own meditation circle, the symbols beneath his feet still glowing with eldritch energies that would have blinded mortal eyes. The time for subtlety was ending. Soon, very soon, the word-bearers would take the final step on their journey away from the Emperor's light and into the welcoming embrace of powers far greater than any mortal ruler. And if Magnus the Red sought to interfere with that destiny, then perhaps it was time the Crimson King learned what it truly meant to commune with the denizens of the warp's deepest regions. The gods were always hungry for new servants, and a psyker of Magnus's caliber would make a prize beyond measure. The game had begun in earnest now. Though only one side fully understood the rules, the other would learn them soon enough, written in fire and blood across the stars themselves. Chapter 3. Whispers of the Lodge. The warrior lodges had begun as brotherhood, bonds of camaraderie that transcended the rigid hierarchies of legion structure. In the early days of the Great Crusade, they had been sanctioned, even encouraged, as a means for Astartes from different companies and chapters to share their experiences and forge deeper bonds of loyalty. Yet like so many things touched by the hand of corruption, what had begun as light was slowly being turned to shadow. Deep within the belly of an abandoned Imperial cargo hauler, drifting at the edge of a dead system, representatives from 5 different legions gathered in a chamber that had been stripped of all identifying marks. The ship itself bore no heraldry, no indication of its origin or purpose, making it the perfect meeting place for those who sought to conduct business away from the watchful eyes of their Primarchs and Legion command structures. Erebus stood at the chamber's center, his word-bearer colors hidden beneath a simple grey robe that could have belonged to any number of Imperial functionaries. Around him, arranged in a precise circle that followed no pattern taught in any Imperial manual, sat the representatives of lodges that had spread across the galaxy, like seeds carried on stellar winds. Each bore the marks of their legion, yet all shared something else, a hunger in their eyes that spoke of appetites that could not be satisfied by mere victory or glory. "Brothers," Erebus began, his voice carrying the weight of ritual and the promise of revelation, "we gather not as servants of distant masters, but as seekers of truth. The Emperor has given us strength, but he has withheld knowledge. Our Primarchs lead us to victory, but they cannot lead us to understanding. That understanding, that true illumination, can only come from older sources." To his left sat Callus Typhon, first captain of the Death Guard's first great company, a warrior whose dedication to duty had made him legend among his brothers. Yet Typhon's eyes held a darkness now that had not been there when he first took his oaths of loyalty. The recent campaigns had shown him the limitations of Imperial doctrine, the way that rigid adherence to regulations could lead to unnecessary casualties and strategic failures. "You speak of knowledge, First Chaplain," Typhon said, his voice carrying the guttural tones of Barbarous. "Yet thus far your lodge has offered only philosophy and speculation. My men die while we debate the nature of power. If these ancient sources you mention possess wisdom that can preserve Imperial lives, then share it freely." Erebus smiled, recognizing the hunger beneath Typhon's pragmatic words. The Death Guard captain had been chosen carefully, selected not for his weakness, but for his strength. A man devoted to duty could be turned, if that duty could be redirected toward a more worthy cause than blind obedience to a distant emperor. Patience, brother. Knowledge without preparation is dangerous. Wisdom without understanding leads to madness. But tonight, for those who have proven themselves ready, the first lessons can be shared. Across the circle from Typhon, 2 lunar wolves observed the proceedings with the calculating silence that had made their legion the Emperor's chosen spear tip. Sergeant Loken of the 10th Company and Captain Torgadon of the 2nd had come to this gathering, expecting the usual lodge business, discussions of tactics, and the sharing of battle experiences. Instead, they found themselves witnesses to something far more significant. "These lessons you speak of," Torgadon said carefully, his hand resting near the bolt pistol at his side, "do they align with the imperial truth? The Emperor has forbidden the worship of gods and the practice of superstition. We are warriors of reason, not cultists chasing shadows." The challenge hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Around the circle, the other representatives shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the moment of decision that had arrived. Erebus had anticipated this resistance, had planned for it, yet the timing was crucial. Too much pressure, too quickly, and the entire enterprise would collapse. Too little, and the opportunity would be lost. "The imperial truth," Erebus replied slowly, "is a truth for mortals, for the masses who cannot bear the weight of deeper understanding. But we are not mortals, brothers. We are Astartes, chosen of the Gene Fathers, elevated beyond the limitations of baseline humanity. Should we not have access to truths that mortals cannot comprehend?" He gestured to the walls around them, where symbols had been carefully inscribed in what appeared to be random scratches and scoring. To untrained eyes, they were meaningless damage from the hauler's years of service. But to those who knew how to look, they formed patterns that spoke to parts of the mind that existed beyond conscious thought. What you see here are not the crude idols of primitive peoples, but mathematical expressions of cosmic forces that predate human civilization. The Emperor knows of these forces, has even harnessed them in the creation of the Primarchs themselves. Yet he denies us this knowledge, keeps us ignorant while he pursues his own transcendence. The words were carefully chosen, each one designed to plant seeds of doubt that would grow in fertile soil. Erebus watched as his audience absorbed the implications, saw the first cracks appear in the foundations of their unquestioning loyalty. From the shadows near the chamber's entrance, Argel Tal watched the proceedings with growing horror. He had followed the coded transmissions that had led him here, tracked the secret communications that flowed between lodge members across multiple legions. What he witnessed now confirmed his worst fears and exceeded them. This was not simply corruption spreading through the word-bearers. This was a coordinated effort to subvert the entire Astartes project, to turn the Emperor's greatest weapons against their creator. Erebus was not merely a fallen chaplain seeking personal power, but an architect of treason on a scale that defied comprehension. Argel Tal's enhanced hearing caught every whispered word as Erebus began to speak of entities that dwelled in the spaces between stars, beings of such ancient wisdom that they had shaped the galaxy before humanity had learned to make fire. The first chaplain's voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate not with the ear, but with something deeper, creating a hypnotic cadence that made his blasphemous words seem almost reasonable. "Consider," Erebus continued, "the nature of the warp itself. Imperial doctrine teaches us that it is merely a tool for faster-than-light travel, a realm of energy to be harnessed but not explored. Yet psychers among our ranks report encounters with entities dwelling within that realm, beings of vast intelligence and power who offer knowledge in exchange for simple recognition. Typhon leaned forward, his scarred features intent with interest. You speak as if these entities are real, not mere warp phantoms or psychic echoes. More real than the Emperor himself, Erebus replied, and the casual blasphemy of the statement sent ripples of shock through the assembled Astartes. The beings I speak of are eternal, unchanging, present at the birth of stars and witnesses to the death of galaxies. They offer partnership, not slavery, power shared willingly, not hoarded jealously. The lunar wolves exchanged glances, uncertainty replacing their initial skepticism. Torgadon's hand had moved away from his weapon, drawn instead to a pendant that hung around his neck, a gift from the lodge that he had worn without thinking of its significance. "What manner of partnership?" Loken asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Erebus stood, moving to the center of the circle where the inscribed symbols converged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. As he spoke, his words began to carry weight that transcended their meaning, as if the very air around him had become thick with possibility. They ask only for acknowledgement, for recognition of their rightful place as humanity's guides and teachers. In exchange, they offer wisdom that could end the Great Crusade, not in centuries, but in mere decades. Technologies that could make the Imperium invincible. Strategies that could unite the galaxy under a single, enlightened rule. The promise hung in the air like incense, intoxicating in its implications. Yet before Erebus could continue, the chamber's entrance exploded inward in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Imperial fists in the yellow and black of their legion burst through the breach, bolt rifles raised and ready. "By order of the Imperial Fist Patrol vessel, Adamant Resolve," the lead sergeant declared, his voice carrying the absolute authority of Rogel Dawn's gene line. "This vessel is under investigation for suspected contraband activities. All personnel will submit to immediate inspection and interrogation." Chaos erupted as the lodge members scattered, some reaching for concealed weapons, while others sought escape routes that did not exist. The careful atmosphere of mystical revelation shattered like glass before the harsh reality of Imperial law enforcement. Argel Tal pressed himself deeper into the shadows, watching as Erebus moved with impossible speed toward a concealed exit that opened into the hauler's ventilation systems. The first chaplain's face showed no surprise at the Imperial Fist arrival, only calculating assessment of a situation that had become untenable. The lodge meeting was over, but its work was done. The seeds had been planted, the first cracks opened in the armor of Imperial loyalty. What had begun as curiosity would grow into hunger, and hunger would eventually bloom into betrayal. As bolt fire filled the chamber, and the lodge members fought desperately against their captors, Argel Tal slipped away through maintenance passages that led back to his own hidden transport. He had witnessed the birth of something terrible, a conspiracy that threatened not just the word-bearers, but the entire Imperium. The question now was whether he could expose Erebus's treachery before the corruption spread beyond the point of containment. Time was running short, and the architect of damnation was already 3 steps ahead of those who sought to stop him. Chapter 4. The trap is set. The fortress monastery of the 1,000 Suns gleamed like a jewel against the void, its crystalline spires reaching toward distant stars with architectural precision that spoke of minds devoted to the pursuit of perfect knowledge. Within its highest tower, Magnus the Red sat in contemplation, surrounded by tomes that contained the accumulated wisdom of a dozen conquered worlds. Yet for all his vast learning, the mystery that had brought him here remained tantalizingly beyond his grasp. The psychic disturbances emanating from the word-bearer's fleet had grown stronger, more focused, carrying harmonics that spoke of deliberate cultivation rather than mere emotional turbulence. Magnus had spent days analyzing the patterns, cross-referencing them against every text in his considerable library, yet their true nature remained elusive. It was as if someone with considerable skill was deliberately obscuring the source, creating layers of misdirection that would have challenged even his extraordinary abilities. A tremor in the warp, barely perceptible to even his heightened senses, drew Magnus from his meditations. This was different from the emanations he had been tracking, cleaner somehow, touched with the distinctive psychic signature of one who bore Lorgar's gene seed, yet remained untainted by whatever darkness had begun to infect the word-bearers. The touch was tentative, almost fearful, carrying with it a burden of knowledge that its bearer desperately needed to share. Magnus opened his mind carefully, allowing the foreign presence to approach while maintaining the psychic shields that had protected him through decades of warp exploration. What he encountered was not the corruption he had expected, but rather a soul in torment, a loyal servant of the Imperium who had witnessed something that threatened the very foundations of everything he believed. The contact resolved into images, memories shared across the vast distances between ships through the medium of pure thought. Magnus saw through another's eyes the ritual chambers hidden in the depths of the Fidelitas Lex, witnessed the blasphemous ceremonies that Erebus had been conducting in secret. He felt the horror and betrayal that had driven this unknown word-bearer to reach out across the void, seeking aid from any source that might help him stop the cancer that was spreading through his legion. "I am Argel Toll," the psychic voice whispered in Magnus's consciousness, carrying with it the weight of desperate hope. "Chaplain of the word-bearers, servant of the Emperor, witness to treachery that threatens not just my legion, but the entire Imperium. I have seen First Chaplain Erebus commune with entities that should not exist, watched him corrupt my brothers with promises of power that come from sources older than human civilization." Magnus absorbed the transmitted memories with growing alarm. The images were fragmentary, but clear enough to confirm his worst suspicions about the disturbances he had been tracking. This was not mere psychic turbulence, or the natural result of emotional trauma following Monarchia's destruction. This was deliberate corruption, the work of someone who had made contact with forces that existed beyond the boundaries of acceptable imperial doctrine. "Your courage in reaching out honors your legion," Magnus replied, his mental voice carrying the authority and compassion that had made him beloved among his own sons. "But the entities your first chaplain communes with are more dangerous than you know. They are parasites that feed on human emotion and ambition, beings that will promise anything to gain a foothold in our reality." The psychic connection strengthened as trust built between the two warriors, forming a bridge of shared purpose across the void. Through that bridge, Magnus shared his own knowledge of the warp's darker regions, the entities that dwelt in spaces where sanity became negotiable and reality bent to alien wills. "Then you know why I have contacted you," Argeltal responded, relief coloring his mental voice. "Erebus planned something terrible for my Primarch, a final ritual that will complete Lorgar's corruption and bind him to these entities forever. The ceremony is planned for when we reach Cor Secundus, during the compliance celebrations. He believes the emotional resonance of victory will provide the perfect moment to complete his work." Magnus considered the tactical situation with the calculating mind that had made him one of the most formidable strategists among the Primarchs. Cor Secundus was a newly compliant world, its population still celebrating their integration into the Imperium. The emotional atmosphere would indeed be charged with the kind of psychic energy that made warp manipulation easier, providing perfect cover for a ritual of the magnitude Erebus was apparently planning. "We must coordinate our efforts," Magnus declared, his mental voice taking on the commanding tone he used when addressing his own warriors. "I will bring a strike force to Cor Secundus under the pretense of observing the compliance ceremonies. When Erebus begins his ritual, we will be ready to intervene." The plan took shape through shared thoughts and images, each detail refined through the combined expertise of both warriors. Argyle would monitor Erebus's preparations, identifying the exact location and timing of the ritual, while gathering any loyal word-bearers who might assist in the confrontation. Magnus would position his forces for maximum impact, striking at the moment when Erebus was most vulnerable. Yet even as they planned, neither warrior realized that their psychic communications were being observed. In the shadows of his private sanctum aboard the Fidelitas Lex, Erebus felt the gentle pressure of foreign thoughts brushing against the edges of his consciousness. His psychic senses, honed by decades of communion with entities that existed beyond mortal comprehension, detected the careful probe that Magnus had extended toward his ship. More alarming still was the response from within the fleet itself, an answering call that could only come from one of his own brothers. The realization struck him like a physical blow. Someone among the word-bearers had discovered his work and was actively seeking to betray him to outside forces. Worse still, that someone had made contact with Magnus the Red, whose psychic abilities were more than capable of unraveling everything Erebus had built. Erebus rose from his meditation circle, the symbols carved into the chamber's floor still glowing with eldritch energies that would have blinded mortal eyes. The time for subtlety had passed. If Magnus was moving against him, then the final phase of Lorgar's corruption would have to be accelerated, regardless of the risks involved. The first chaplain moved through the ship's corridors with purpose, his enhanced senses mapping the psychic emanations of every soul aboard. It did not take long to identify the source of the treachery. Argyle quarters blazed like a beacon to his corrupted perception, the younger chaplain's psychic signature still carrying traces of contact with the Crimson King. "So," Erebus whispered to the shadows that danced at the edge of his vision, entities that existed in the spaces between heartbeats and drew sustenance from mortal fear. "We have a traitor in our midst, one who would deny his Primarch the gifts that await him, who would preserve ignorance over enlightenment." The shadows stirred at his words, recognizing the promise of violence that colored his thoughts. They had been patient, these servants of ancient powers, feeding on the scraps of emotion that Erebus provided, while waiting for the moment when they could manifest more fully in the material realm. That moment was approaching faster than anticipated. Erebus began to weave the preparations for a ritual that would dwarf anything he had attempted before. The corruption of Lorgar could no longer be a gradual process, a careful cultivation of doubt and ambition over months or years. It would have to be a sudden transformation, a psychic assault that would overwhelm the Primarch's defenses and bind him irrevocably to the god's service. The risks were enormous. Such a rapid corruption could kill Lorgar outright, or worse, leave him a broken shell incapable of the leadership his legion required. But the alternative was exposure, the unraveling of decades of careful planning, and the loss of the greatest prize the gods had ever sought. Deep in the ship's holds, Erebus began to gather the materials he would need for the final ritual. Ancient texts written in languages that predated human speech, artifacts recovered from dead worlds that had once hosted civilizations wise enough to recognize the true nature of reality. Most importantly, he would need sacrifice, the spiritual energy of souls willingly offered to powers that dwelt beyond the veil of ordinary existence. The word-bearers who had joined his cause would serve that purpose, their lives given meaning through their contribution to Lorgar's ascension. It was an honor they had been prepared for since their first exposure to the truth, though most did not yet realize the form that honor would take. As Erebus prepared for the culmination of his life's work, Argeltal felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. Something had changed in the psychic atmosphere aboard the Fidelitas Lex, a subtle shift that spoke of preparations being made for events that would reshape the Legion forever. The trap was indeed being set, but it remained to be seen who would be caught in its closing jaws. The corruption of Lorgar hung in the balance, and with it, the fate of not just the word-bearers but potentially the entire galaxy. Time was running short, and the final moves in a game of cosmic significance were about to be played. The only question was whether the forces of loyalty would prove strong enough to stand against powers that had been old when the stars themselves were young. The darkness was stirring, and even the light of distant suns seemed dimmed by the shadow of what was coming. Chapter 5. Blood and Faith. The world of Cor Secundus burned with the fires of celebration, its newly compliant population gathered in vast amphitheaters to witness the glory of imperial rule. Yet beneath the surface revelry, in the depths of an ancient temple that predated human settlement by millennia, darkness prepared to claim its greatest prize. The stone walls of the sanctuary had been carved with symbols that hurt mortal eyes to perceive, geometric patterns that existed in dimensions beyond human comprehension, all focused toward a central altar where corruption would be made manifest. Erebus knelt before that altar, his word-bearer colors abandoned in favor of robes that seemed to drink the light from the chamber's flickering torches. Around him, arranged in a precise circle that followed no imperial doctrine, 33 of his most devoted followers chanted words in languages that had been old when the stars were young. At the circle's heart, bound by chains forged from psychically reactive metals, Lorgar struggled against bonds that held not just his body, but his soul itself. The Primarch of the Word-Bearers had come to this place expecting a simple ceremony of compliance, a ritual blessing to consecrate Cor Secundus as a loyal world of the Imperium. Instead, he found himself trapped in a nightmare of betrayal that threatened everything he believed about duty, faith, and the nature of divinity itself. "My lord," Erebus whispered, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the very foundations of reality. "The moment of truth has arrived. The Emperor has rejected your devotion, cast aside your faith as if it were meaningless. But the true gods have watched, and they have found you worthy of gifts beyond mortal comprehension." The air in the chamber grew thick with presence, entities that existed beyond the boundaries of normal space, pressing against the barriers that separated the material realm from the roiling chaos of the warp. Lorgar felt their attention like weight upon his soul, ancient intelligences that promised power in exchange for simple acknowledgement of their supremacy. "This is blasphemy," Lorgar gasped, his enhanced physiology struggling against bonds that drew their strength from forces older than human civilization. "You speak of entities that deny the imperial truth, that would see humanity enslaved to powers beyond our understanding." "The imperial truth is a lie," Erebus replied, his hands weaving patterns in the air that left trails of eldritch fire. "A comforting fiction told to masses who cannot bear the weight of cosmic reality. But you are no mere mortal, my lord. You are a Primarch, a demigod created to bridge the gap between human limitation and divine transcendence. Why settle for the Emperor's distant approval when you could have the direct communion of gods who offer partnership, not slavery?" The ritual reached its crescendo as the chanting cultists raised their voices in harmonic convergence that made the temple stones themselves vibrate with sympathetic resonance. Reality began to fray at the edges, allowing glimpses of the realm beyond, where entities of impossible geometry waited with infinite patience for the barriers to fall. It was then that the temple's ancient doors exploded inward, in a cascade of psychic force that shattered stone and sent cultists tumbling like broken dolls. Magnus the Red strode through the breach, his crimson armor blazing with protective wards that turned aside the corrupt emanations filling the chamber. Behind him came a strike force of 1,000 suns, their weapons raised and ready, their psychic disciplines focused like spears of pure will against the darkness that sought to claim their gene-father's brother. "Enough!" Magnus's voice thundered through the chamber with authority that made even the demonic entities recoil. "I have seen the truth of what you offer, Erebus, and I name it for what it is. Not enlightenment, but damnation. Not partnership, but parasitism. You would make our brother a slave to entities that care nothing for humanity's future." Erebus rose from his position before the altar, his face twisting into an expression of rage that revealed the full extent of his corruption. The mask of righteous purpose that he had worn for so long finally fell away, exposing the malevolent intelligence that had guided his actions since before he had first donned word-bearer colors. "You understand nothing, Red King," Erebus snarled, power crackling around his form as the entities he served poured their strength into their chosen vessel. "You cling to ignorance, while wisdom offers itself freely. The gods I serve have watched civilizations rise and fall across countless eons. They know the price of power and the cost of transcendence. What the Emperor offers is stagnation. What they provide is evolution itself." The battle began not with bolt fire or blade work, but with a clash of wills that sent shock waves rippling through the warp itself. Magnus extended his consciousness like a weapon, striking at the corrupt energies that sustained Erebus's transformation, while the fallen chaplain countered with techniques learned from entities that existed beyond mortal comprehension. Psychic fire blazed between them, each combatant drawing upon reserves of power that could have leveled cities or turned back the tide of battle for entire star systems. Magnus fought with the discipline and knowledge accumulated through decades of careful study, his attacks precisely focused and devastatingly effective. Erebus countered with raw force, channeled through conduits of pure corruption, his techniques wild and unpredictable but terrifyingly powerful. As the two champions battled for supremacy, the chamber around them became a war zone of competing realities. Where Magnus's power touched, the corrupt symbols carved into the walls burned away, replaced by equations and formulae that spoke of ordered knowledge and reasoned understanding. Where Erebus's influence spread, the stone itself began to shift and flow, taking on geometries that violated the basic laws of physics. Yet even as their psychic duel raged, another battle erupted across the temple's blood-slicked floor. Argel-Tal burst through a side entrance, leading 24 word-bearers who had remained loyal to their original oath despite the corruption spreading through their ranks. They moved with the coordinated precision of warriors who had fought together for decades, their bolters spitting death as they engaged the cultists who sought to complete the ritual, despite the chaos erupting around them. "For Lorgar!" Argel-Tal roared, his Crozius Arcanum blazing with the pure light of unshakable faith. "For the Emperor! For the truth that will not be corrupted by lies!" The loyal word-bearers fought with desperate fury, knowing that failure meant not just their own deaths, but the damnation of their Primarch, and potentially the entire Legion. They cut through cultists with methodical efficiency, each kill bringing them closer to the altar, where Lorgar struggled against bonds that grew weaker as Erebus's concentration was divided between multiple threats. But the cultists were not alone in their defense. As the ritual neared its culmination, the barriers between dimensions weakened enough for entities of pure malevolence to manifest within the chamber. They came not as clearly defined forms, but as shifting amalgamations of nightmare and hunger, beings whose very presence caused reality to buckle and warp around them. Magnus felt their manifestation like a physical blow, the sudden intrusion of alien intelligence into the material realm, sending ripples of agony through his enhanced consciousness. These were not the lesser entities he had encountered in his explorations of the warp's outer reaches, but servants of powers so ancient and vast that their true names could not be spoken without risking sanity itself. "You see now the futility of resistance," Erebus laughed, his voice carrying harmonics that belonged to no human throat. "My masters have invested too much in this moment to allow interference from ignorant children who think themselves wise. Lorgar will accept their gifts, and through him, the entire Imperium will learn to kneel before powers that were old when your emperor was nothing but mortal ambition." Yet even as the demonic entities began their assault on the loyalist forces, Magnus found within himself reserves of power that he had never before accessed. The threat to his brother, the sight of Lorgar's suffering, awakened something primal in his psychic nature that transcended mere technique or learned discipline. This was the fury of family betrayed, the rage of brotherhood violated, channeled through abilities that could reshape reality itself. The Crimson King's counterattack came not as a focused beam or targeted strike, but as a wave of pure annihilation that swept across the chamber like a psychic tsunami. Where it touched the manifested daemons, they were not merely banished, but utterly destroyed, their essence scattered across dimensions in a way that would take millennia to reassemble. The corrupt symbols carved into the temple walls blazed with cleansing fire that burned away centuries of accumulated taint, leaving behind stone that gleamed as if newly cut. Erebus staggered under the assault, his connection to his demonic patrons severed by the sheer overwhelming force of Magnus's retaliation. For the first time since the battle began, fear flickered in his eyes, as he realized that he had underestimated both the depth of Magnus's power and the strength of the bonds that connected the Primarchs to one another. "Impossible," he gasped, dark blood streaming from his eyes as the psychic backlash tore through his enhanced physiology. "The gods promised me victory. They showed me visions of triumph, of Lorgar kneeling willingly before their altars." "Your gods showed you what they wished you to see," Magnus replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "They are parasites, Erebus. They promise everything and deliver nothing but corruption and madness, but they made one critical error in their calculations." The Crimson King advanced across the chamber, his form blazing with psychic fire that turned the shadows into nothing more than memory. Behind him, the 1,000 Suns moved with coordinated precision, their own abilities focused and directed by their Primarch's will into a weapon that could cleanse corruption from the very atoms of matter. "What error?" Erebus demanded, raising his own power in a desperate attempt to hold back the tide of annihilation that approached. "They assumed that Lorgar stood alone," Magnus answered, his single eye blazing like a star. "They forgot that he has brothers who will never abandon him to darkness, no matter what lies they whisper or promises they make." It was then that Argel Tull struck, his Crozius Arcanum cutting through the psychic interference that surrounded Erebus like a blade through fog. The weapon, blessed with the pure faith of one who had never wavered in his loyalty to the Emperor, found its mark in the fallen chaplain's chest, with the inevitability of divine justice itself. Erebus looked down at the weapon protruding from his chest with an expression of shock that gradually gave way to understanding. The wound was not merely physical but spiritual, cutting through the bonds that connected him to his dark patrons and severing the channels through which corrupt power had flowed. This was not foreseen, he whispered, dark blood frothing from his lips. The calculations were perfect. Every variable was accounted for. How could faithful servants of ignorance triumph over the wisdom of ages? Because you never understood what faith truly means, Argeltal replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of unshakable conviction. You mistake it for ignorance, for the refusal to seek knowledge. But true faith is the recognition that some knowledge comes at too high a price. Some truths are not worth learning. Some powers are not worth wielding. Erebus collapsed to his knees, his life flowing away with each labored breath. Around him, the temple began to shake as the psychic energies he had so carefully orchestrated collapsed back upon themselves without his will to direct them. The ritual was broken, its power scattered to the winds, and with it died the opportunity that the Chaos Gods had spent decades engineering. The work will continue, he gasped with his final breath. Others will take up the torch. The corruption has already spread too far to be contained. You have won this battle, but the war... His words trailed off into silence as death claimed him, and with his passing, something fundamental shifted in the currents of fate itself. The carefully laid plans that had been decades in the making crumbled like sand castles before the tide, leaving behind possibilities that even the most far-seeing prophets could not have predicted. Lorgar looked up from the altar where his bonds had finally dissolved, his golden features marked by an expression of horror and gratitude that would remain with him for the rest of his immortal existence. He had come within moments of damnation, saved only by the intervention of a brother he had barely known, and a chaplain whose loyalty had proven stronger than the promises of gods. "Magnus," he whispered, his voice hoarse from his struggles. "How can I ever repay what you have done here?" The Crimson King helped his brother to his feet, his expression carrying the weight of knowledge that would forever change how both Primarchs viewed their roles in the galaxy's future. "By remembering what we learned here today," Magnus replied, his gaze sweeping across the chamber where the forces of corruption had been broken upon the rock of unwavering loyalty. "By ensuring that no other son of the Emperor ever faces such temptation without brothers to stand beside him. And by helping me make certain that the cancer Erebus planted in our legions is cut out completely, no matter how far it may have spread." The architect of the Horus Heresy was dead, struck down before he could complete the work that would have plunged the galaxy into 10,000 years of darkness. Yet his death was not an ending, but a beginning, the first step on a path that would lead to revelations about the true nature of chaos and humanity's place in a universe filled with ancient and malevolent powers. The battle was won, but the war for the soul of the Imperium had only just begun. Chapter 6. The Crimson King's Revelation. The silence that followed Erebus's death was not peaceful, but pregnant with the weight of revelation, a stillness that spoke of fundamental changes in the cosmic order. The ancient temple of Cor Secundus bore the scars of the battle that had just concluded, its walls blackened by psychic fire, and its floor stained with the blood of those who had chosen corruption over duty. Yet beneath the physical damage lay something far more significant: the death of a future that would now never come to pass. Lorgar knelt beside the altar where he had come so close to damnation, his golden features marked by an expression of horror that would never entirely fade from his noble countenance. The chains that had bound him were gone, dissolved by the severing of Erebus's connection to his dark patrons. But the Primarch of the Word-Bearers felt as if invisible shackles still constrained his soul. The weight of what he had almost become, The knowledge of how close he had come to betraying everything he claimed to believe pressed upon him like the gravity of a collapsing star. "How did I not see it?" Lorgar whispered, his voice carrying the anguish of a soul confronting its own weaknesses. Erebus was my first chaplain, keeper of the Legion's spiritual well-being. I trusted him with the souls of my sons, placed him above all others in matters of faith and doctrine. Yet all the while, he served powers that sought our destruction. Magnus approached his brother with the careful steps of one who understood the delicate nature of wounded pride. The Crimson King's single eye held depths of knowledge that few mortals could have borne to witness. Yet when he looked upon Lorgar, there was only compassion and the patient wisdom of one who had gazed into the abyss and chosen to turn away. "Corruption is insidious, brother," Magnus said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won understanding. "It does not announce itself with fanfare or declare its intentions openly. It whispers in moments of doubt, offers solutions in times of desperation, presents itself as enlightenment to those who hunger for deeper meaning. Erebus was already touched by darkness before he ever donned our father's colors. The revelation struck Lorgar like a physical blow. The implications were staggering, suggesting that the corruption had been present within his legion for decades, perhaps since its very founding. How many decisions had been influenced by Erebus's subtle manipulations? How many worlds had been brought to compliance under the guidance of one who served entities antithetical to everything the Imperium represented? "Then my entire crusade has been built upon a foundation of lies," Lorgar said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every world we conquered, every population we brought into compliance, every victory we claimed in the Emperor's name was tainted by the presence of corruption within our own ranks." No. The word came from Argel Tal, spoken with the quiet conviction of one whose faith had been tested in the crucible of absolute darkness and emerged unbroken. The loyal chaplain stepped forward, his armor still bearing the scars of the battle just concluded, his Crozius Arcanum gleaming with the light of unshakable belief. "The corruption was Erebus's alone, my lord. The rest of us served with pure hearts and honest purpose. Our victories were real, our service genuine. Do not let his betrayal poison the memory of those who died, believing they served a righteous cause." Magnus nodded in agreement, recognizing the wisdom in the younger Astartes' words. "The entities that Erebus served are parasites, brother. They corrupt what already exists rather than creating anything new. The faith of your sons, their devotion to duty, and their love for humanity, these things were real. Erebus merely sought to redirect them toward darker purposes." The explanation offered some measure of comfort, yet Lorgar remained troubled by implications that reached far beyond his own legion. If corruption of this magnitude could exist undetected within the Word-bearers, what other legions might harbor similar taint? How far had the Warrior Lodge network spread, and how many Astartes had been exposed to the insidious whispers that promised power in exchange for loyalty? "You spoke of entities dwelling in the warp," Lorgar said, turning his attention to Magnus with the focused intensity of one seeking to understand cosmic truths. "Erebus called them gods, claimed they were more worthy of worship than our father. What are they, truly?" Magnus considered the question carefully, weighing how much truth his brother could bear in his current state. The full scope of Chaos's malevolence was vast enough to drive lesser minds to madness, yet Lorgar deserved honesty after coming so close to becoming its unwitting servant. "They are ancient beyond mortal comprehension," Magnus began, his voice taking on the cadence of one imparting fundamental knowledge. "Beings of pure emotion and appetite that feed upon the psychic emanations of sentient life. They have existed since the first thinking creature experienced rage, despair, ambition, or excess. In the realm of the warp, they have grown powerful enough to reshape reality according to their whims. The Crimson King gestured toward the ruined temple around them, where traces of otherworldly geometry still lingered, despite the cleansing fire that had purged the worst corruption. They cannot exist fully in our reality, without anchors, mortal servants who open doorways between dimensions through ritual and sacrifice. Erebus was attempting to make you such an anchor, to transform you into a conduit through which they could pour their influence into the material realm. Lorgar's enhanced intellect grasped the implications immediately. A corrupted Primarch would not merely be a single powerful servant, but a nexus through which an entire legion could be turned to darkness. The gene-seed bonds that connected him to his sons would have become chains of corruption, spreading the taint to every word-bearer across the galaxy. And through me, they would have reached my sons, Lorgar said, the words heavy with the weight of catastrophe averted. 18,000 Astartes transformed from the Emperor's servants into weapons of entities that seek humanity's destruction. More than that, Magnus replied grimly. Erebus had already begun corrupting elements within other legions through his warrior lodge network. Your fall would have been the signal for them to accelerate their own efforts. The Death Guard, the Lunar Wolves, perhaps others would have followed in rapid succession. Within a generation, the Emperor's greatest weapons could have been turned entirely against him. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its potential consequences. Yet it also revealed something hopeful. The entities that sought humanity's corruption were not omnipotent. They could be fought, their servants defeated, their plans disrupted by those with sufficient will and knowledge to oppose them. Then we must act, Lorgar declared, rising from his position beside the altar, with renewed purpose blazing in his golden eyes. If corruption has spread to other legions, it must be rooted out completely. Every lodge member must be questioned, every suspect practice investigated, every hint of taint purged without mercy. Argyltal stepped forward, offering his Primarch support, both physical and spiritual. My lord, there are loyal brothers within our own ranks who suspected Erebus's activities, but lacked the evidence to act. Chaplain Zaphen of the 7th Company, Captain Marduk of the 34th, Brother Sergeant Torgal of the assault squads. They can help identify those who were corrupted and those who remained pure. The mention of loyal elements within the Legion brought a measure of relief to Lorgar's troubled features. Not all of his sons had been deceived by Erebus's lies. Many had maintained their fidelity to the original purpose, despite the subtle corruption that had infected their spiritual leadership. Gather them, Lorgar commanded. Form investigative teams to examine every aspect of our Legion's practices since Monarchia. Question every brother who attended lodge meetings. Examine every ritual conducted by Erebus or his adherents. Investigate every world where we detected unusual warp activity. Leave no stone unturned, no shadow unexplored. Magnus observed the transformation taking place within his brother with satisfaction. The shame and horror of near corruption was being transmuted into righteous determination, the very faith that Erebus had sought to corrupt now becoming a weapon against the darkness he had served. I will assist however I can, Magnus offered. My knowledge of the warp and its inhabitants may prove valuable in identifying signs of corruption that others might miss. The 1,000 Suns have techniques for detecting psychic taint that could help separate the innocent from the guilty. The offer of cooperation between legions represented something unprecedented in the history of the Great Crusade. The Primarchs had always been intended to operate independently, each leading their forces according to their own expertise and temperament. Yet the threat they now faced transcended the boundaries of individual legions, requiring coordination on a scale that few had ever contemplated. "There is something else we must consider," Magnus continued, his expression growing more grave. "The other legions must be warned of what we have discovered here. If Erebus had contacts within the Death Guard and Lunar Wolves, their Primarchs deserve to know the truth about the entities that seek to corrupt their sons." Lorgar nodded slowly, recognizing the necessity, despite his reluctance to spread word of his own near fall to corruption. The pride that had made him vulnerable to Erebus's manipulation in the first place rebelled against the idea of revealing his weakness to his brothers. Yet the alternative was to allow the same corruption to spread unopposed through other legions. "Mortarion and Horus must be informed," Lorgar agreed reluctantly. "If their sons have been exposed to the same influences that nearly claimed me, they have the right to know. But we must be careful in how we approach them. The knowledge of warp entities and psychic corruption goes against the Imperial truth. Our father has forbidden such discussions for reasons we are only now beginning to understand." The Emperor's prohibition against acknowledging the existence of gods or supernatural entities took on new significance in light of recent revelations. It was not mere atheistic dogma, but a deliberate policy designed to starve the chaos entities of the recognition they required to manifest in the material realm. Yet that same policy had left the legions vulnerable to subtle corruption precisely because they lacked the knowledge needed to identify and resist such influences. "Perhaps," Magnus suggested carefully, "it is time for our father to reconsider the limitations of the Imperial truth. The entities we face cannot be defeated through ignorance. They can only be fought by those who understand their nature and methods." The suggestion bordered on heresy by the standards of Imperial doctrine, yet both Primarchs recognized its fundamental truth. The war against chaos could not be won by pretending it did not exist. It required knowledge, preparation, and the kind of spiritual strength that could only come from understanding the true nature of the enemy. As the three warriors stood among the ruins of Erebus's final ritual, they represented something new in the galaxy's history, the first alliance of loyal servants specifically dedicated to opposing the corruption that had nearly claimed one of the Emperor's greatest sons. They could not know that their actions had prevented the greatest catastrophe in human history, or that their cooperation would become the foundation for a new golden age of Imperial expansion. What they did know was that Erebus's death was not an ending, but a beginning. The corruption he had spread must be rooted out completely. The knowledge he had hoarded must be turned against his former masters, and the legions he had sought to corrupt must be made stronger than ever before. The architect of the Horus Heresy was dead, but the war for humanity's soul had only just begun, and for the first time since the entities of chaos had begun their infiltration of the Imperium, they faced opponents who understood both the magnitude of the threat and the price of failure. The galaxy would be a very different place because of what had transpired in the ancient temple of Cor Secundus. Whether it would be better or worse remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: the future that Erebus had envisioned would never come to pass. His death had changed everything. Chapter 7. The Wolf King's Hunt. The void between stars had never seemed so vast as it did in the days following Erebus's death, when the carefully woven network of corruption began to unravel like a tapestry, pulled apart by vengeful hands. Across the galaxy, Lodge members who had counted on their first chaplain's protection found themselves suddenly exposed, their secret communications cut off, their promised rewards transformed into the bitter taste of abandonment. Yet none felt this isolation more keenly than those who had progressed furthest down the path of corruption, who had already begun to hear whispers in languages that predated human speech. Aboard the battle barge Endurance, flagship of the Death Guard's first great company, Callus Typhon knelt in a chamber that had once been dedicated to the maintenance of his legion's sacred standards. Now it served a far different purpose, its walls covered with symbols that would have horrified any loyal servant of the Imperium. The ritual circle carved into the deck plates still bore traces of the offerings he had made to entities whose true names could not be spoken without risking madness itself. The silence that filled the chamber was not peaceful, but pregnant with the weight of cosmic disappointment. The voices that had whispered promises of transcendence and power beyond mortal comprehension had fallen silent 3 days ago, their sudden absence leaving a void in Typhon's consciousness that ached like a severed limb. Without Erebus to maintain the connections between the Lodge network and their otherworldly patrons, the carefully cultivated relationship between mortal ambition and demonic hunger had withered like a plant deprived of light. Typhon's scarred features bore the marks of his exposure to forces that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. His flesh had begun to show signs of change, subtle alterations that spoke of gifts bestowed by entities who viewed mortal form as merely the raw material for greater works of art. Yet those changes had halted abruptly with Erebus's death, leaving him trapped between humanity and something else entirely, belonging fully to neither realm. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridors beyond his sanctum, heavy boots that struck the deck plates with the measured cadence of warriors who knew no fear. Typhon recognized the distinctive pattern immediately, having heard it countless times during the early days of the Great Crusade, when cooperation between legions was common and trust between gene brothers was assumed rather than questioned. Space wolves. The realization struck him like a physical blow, sending ice through veins that had grown accustomed to the burning touch of otherworldly energies. Leman Russ, the Wolf King of Fenris, had come calling with his savage sons at his back. The implications were staggering, suggesting that word of the corruption had spread far beyond the word-bearers and reached the ears of one of the most dangerous hunters in the galaxy. Typhon moved with desperate efficiency, gathering the most damning evidence of his dabbling in forbidden knowledge and feeding it to the chamber's incinerator. Ancient texts written in languages that hurt the mind to perceive crumbled to ash within seconds, their blasphemous wisdom reduced to nothing more than scattered carbon particles. Ritual implements forged from metals that existed only in dimensions adjacent to reality followed them into the flames, their destruction sending ripples of psychic feedback through the local warp environment. Yet even as he worked to eliminate the evidence of his corruption, Typhon knew that his efforts were likely futile. The Wolf King was renowned for his ability to scent deception, to detect the subtle signs that marked those who had strayed from the path of loyalty. If Russ had come to the Endurance with suspicion in his heart, then no amount of concealment would be sufficient to avoid his scrutiny. The chamber's entrance exploded inward in a shower of sparks and twisted metal as the space wolves breached the sealed portal with the casual efficiency of predators who had cornered their prey. Leman Russ strode through the breach like a force of nature given human form, his massive frame encased in the frost-touched ceramite that bore the marks of 1,000 battlefields. Behind him came a pack of grey hunters, their weapons raised and ready, their enhanced senses cataloguing every detail of the corruption that still lingered in the chamber's atmosphere. "Callus Typhon," Russ said, his voice carrying the authority of one who had been granted the Emperor's mandate to judge his fellow Astartes. "First Captain of the Death Guard," servant of Mortarion, inheritor of Barbarus's toxic legacy. You stand accused of practices forbidden by imperial law and corruption of the spirit that threatens the very foundation of our cause." Typhon faced his accuser with what dignity remained to him, knowing that denial would be pointless in the face of evidence that permeated the very air around them. The Wolf King's enhanced senses would have detected the psychic residue of his rituals the moment he set foot aboard the Endurance, making any attempt at deception not merely futile, but insulting. "What practices do you speak of, Wolf King?" Typhon asked, though his tone carried more resignation than defiance. "I have served the Death Guard with honor since the day I first donned the Legion's colors. Every world I have conquered was claimed in the Emperor's name, every victory achieved in service to the Great Crusade." "Your service record is not in question," Russ replied, his grey eyes scanning the chamber with the intensity of a predator evaluating its environment. "What concerns me are the activities you have pursued in the shadows, the entities you have courted in chambers like this one. The whispers speak of warrior lodges that have strayed from their original purpose, of brothers who have begun to worship powers older than the Imperium itself." The accusation hung in the air like a blade poised to fall, its truth so obvious that any attempt to deny it would have been laughable. Yet Typhon found himself struggling to explain how he had come to this point, how a loyal son of Mortarion had been transformed into something that barely qualified as human any longer. "The lodges began as brotherhood," Typhon said slowly, his words carefully chosen to convey truth without revealing the full extent of his fall. Bonds of camaraderie that transcended the rigid hierarchies of Legion structure. We shared our experiences, our doubts, our hopes for the future. It was only later that Erebus introduced us to other perspectives. The mention of the fallen first chaplain caused Russ's expression to darken with something that might have been satisfaction or might have been regret. Word of Erebus's death had spread quickly through the networks that connected the legions, carrying with it implications that few were prepared to fully comprehend. "Erebus is dead," Russ stated flatly, killed by his own gene brother while attempting a ritual that would have damned not just Lorgar, but potentially the entire Word-Bearers Legion. His corruption has been exposed, his network disrupted, his influence severed. What remains is the cleanup, the identification and elimination of those who were tainted by his teachings. Typhon felt the last vestiges of hope drain from his corrupted soul as the reality of his situation became clear. Without Erebus to maintain the connections to his otherworldly patrons, without the promise of transcendence to justify his betrayal of everything he had once believed, he was nothing more than a traitor awaiting judgment. "I was deceived," Typhon whispered, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Erebus showed us visions of power, of knowledge that could end the Great Crusade in decades rather than centuries. He spoke of entities that offered partnership rather than slavery, wisdom rather than ignorance. How was I to know that their gifts came with a price that no loyal servant should pay?" Russ studied the fallen captain with eyes that had seen every form of corruption the galaxy could produce, from the obvious taint of chaos to the subtle decay of pride and ambition unchecked by wisdom. What he saw in Typhon was neither irredeemable monster nor innocent victim, but something more complex. A warrior who had been offered everything he desired and lacked the strength to refuse. "The entities Erebus served are parasites," Russ said, his voice carrying the weight of knowledge gained through bitter experience. "They promise transcendence, but deliver only slavery, offer wisdom, but provide only madness. Their gifts are poisoned chalices that transform their recipients into weapons against everything they once held dear. The Wolf King gestured to the ruined chamber around them, where the evidence of Typhon's corruption still lingered, despite his desperate attempts at concealment. Yet the corruption can be fought, the taint cleansed, the bonds severed. Erebus's death has weakened their hold on those who served them, creating an opportunity for redemption that may not come again. The offer of salvation, however conditional, struck Typhon like a physical blow. He had expected execution, the summary justice that loyal Astartes traditionally meted out to traitors. Instead, he was being offered a chance to atone for his betrayal, to turn his knowledge of the enemy against those who had sought to use him. "What would you have me do?" Typhon asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me everything," Russ commanded. "Every lodge meeting you attended, every brother who showed interest in Erebus's teachings, every ritual you witnessed or participated in. The corruption spreads like a plague, and like any plague, it must be contained before it can claim more victims." The interrogation that followed lasted for hours, as Typhon revealed the full scope of the network that Erebus had spent decades constructing. Names emerged from his corrupted memory like ghosts returning to haunt the living. Death Guard captains who had embraced the promise of eternal life. Lunar Wolves sergeants who had been seduced by visions of their Primarch's ascension to godhood. Iron Warriors Techmarines who had learned to communion with machine spirits that were something far more malevolent than mere artificial intelligence. Each revelation added another thread to the tapestry of corruption that Russ was methodically unraveling, building a comprehensive picture of how close the Imperium had come to destruction from within. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its ambition, yet it also revealed critical weaknesses that could be exploited by those with the knowledge and will to act. The Lunar Wolves were to be Erebus's greatest prize, Typhon admitted, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. Horus himself was being prepared for corruption, though the process had not yet begun when communications with Erebus were severed. There were plans to engineer a situation where the War Master would be gravely wounded, then offer him healing in exchange for acknowledgement of the entity's power. The revelation sent ice through Russ's veins as he contemplated how close the Imperium had come to losing not just another Primarch, but the one who served as the Emperor's chosen representative among the legions. Horus's corruption would have been a catastrophe beyond measure, transforming the Great Crusade's greatest champion into its most dangerous enemy. "Those plans died with Erebus," Russ declared with grim satisfaction. "But the lodges he established within the Lunar Wolves still exist, their members still susceptible to the whispers of entities that promise easy answers to difficult questions. They must be identified and purged before they can find new leadership to guide them back into darkness." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Horus himself appeared at the chamber's entrance, his magnificent form filling the doorway with presence that spoke of authority, earned through countless victories. The War Master's features bore an expression of barely controlled rage as he surveyed the evidence of corruption that had been festering within one of his brother Primarch's legions. "Brothers," Horus said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute command. "I have just received word from Terra regarding the situation with the word-bearers and the entities that sought to corrupt them. The Emperor has authorized extraordinary measures to root out any remaining taint from the legions. We are to conduct a thorough purge, sparing no effort to ensure that such corruption never again threatens the Imperium." The arrival of the War Master transformed what had been an investigation into something far more significant. A legion-wide campaign against an enemy that most Astartes had never imagined could exist. The resources of the Great Crusade would be turned against the corruption that had nearly claimed Lorgar, bringing to bear the full might of the Emperor's chosen sons against entities that had been old when humanity first looked up at the stars. "I stand ready to assist in whatever way you require," Typhon said, his voice carrying the fervor of one who sought redemption through service. "I have seen the true face of the entities that Erebus served, felt the weight of their promises and the price of their gifts. If my knowledge can help prevent others from following the same path, then perhaps my corruption can serve some useful purpose." Russ nodded slowly, recognizing the sincerity in the fallen captain's words, while maintaining the caution that had kept him alive through centuries of warfare against enemies both conventional and otherworldly. "Redemption is earned through deeds, not words," the Wolf King said. "But the opportunity to earn it will be provided to those who prove their commitment to the truth. The hunt begins now, and it will not end until every trace of corruption has been burned from our ranks." The campaign that followed would be remembered as one of the most thorough purges in Imperial history, a systematic elimination of threats that might have remained hidden for decades, if not for Erebus's premature death. Yet it was also something more, the first coordinated effort by multiple Primarchs to combat an enemy that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional warfare. The corruption had been exposed, but the war against it had only just begun. And for the first time since the entities of chaos had begun their infiltration of the Imperium, they faced opponents who understood both the magnitude of the threat and the price of failure. Chapter 8. The Interrex Alliance. The diplomatic chambers aboard the Vengeful Spirit had been transformed into something unprecedented in the history of the Great Crusade, a meeting place where humanity's future would be negotiated not through conquest, but through conversation. The vast hall that had once hosted war councils dedicated to the prosecution of military campaigns now served as the stage for discussions that could reshape the galaxy's destiny. Ancient banners bearing the symbols of the lunar wolves hung alongside standards that depicted geometric patterns unlike anything in Imperial heraldry, creating a visual testament to the possibility of cooperation between civilizations that had developed along vastly different paths. Horus stood before the great viewing port that dominated the chamber's far wall, his magnificent form silhouetted against the starfield beyond. The War Master's expression carried the weight of responsibility that came with representing not just the Imperium, but humanity itself in negotiations with beings whose technological and philosophical sophistication challenged every assumption about mankind's place in the galaxy. Behind him, arranged in careful formation that spoke of both respect and readiness, stood the finest representatives of Imperial diplomacy and military might. The Interrex delegation had arrived 3 days earlier, their sleek vessels emerging from the warp with a grace that made even the most sophisticated Imperial designs seem crude by comparison. Their ships bore no resemblance to the aggressive profiles favored by the Great Crusade's fleets, instead displaying flowing lines and harmonious proportions that spoke of a civilization that viewed technology as art rather than mere utility. Yet beneath their aesthetic beauty lay defensive capabilities that had kept their territories secure for millennia against threats that most humans could barely comprehend. "War Master," spoke Jefta Knoll, the Interrex ambassador, whose presence radiated an authority that transcended mere political rank. The Alien Alliance's representative bore the enhanced physiology of humanity, taken down a different evolutionary path, his features refined by generations of careful genetic cultivation and technological augmentation. "We have reviewed the evidence you provided regarding the corruption that nearly claimed your brother, Lorgar. The patterns you describe are disturbingly familiar to our own historical records." Horus turned from the viewing port, his attention focusing entirely upon the ambassador, with the intensity that had made him the Emperor's chosen representative among the Primarchs. The weeks of careful negotiation that had brought them to this point represented a diplomatic achievement without precedent in Imperial history, the first time that two human civilizations had met as equals rather than conqueror and conquered. "You have encountered these entities before," Horus said, the words carrying both statement and question. "Your archives speak of struggles against forces that exist beyond the boundaries of normal space, beings that seek to corrupt and consume rather than create or preserve." Noel nodded slowly, his expression carrying the weight of knowledge that few civilizations had been fortunate enough to survive long enough to accumulate. "We call them the Chaos Petherics, the devourers of potential. They have plagued thinking species since the first minds achieved sufficient complexity to generate the psychic emanations upon which they feed. Our ancestors fought a war against them that lasted for thousands of years, learning through bitter experience the techniques necessary to resist their influence. The revelation struck the Imperial delegation like a physical blow, suggesting that the entities which had nearly corrupted Lorgar were not unique threats, but part of a cosmic pattern that had repeated itself across countless worlds and civilizations. The implications were staggering, indicating that the corruption of the word-bearers had been merely the latest attempt in a campaign that spanned geological ages. "What did you learn?" Horus asked, his voice carrying the urgency of one who recognized that humanity's survival might depend upon the knowledge that the Inter-X had accumulated through millennia of struggle. "That they cannot be defeated through ignorance," Noel replied, his words carrying echoes of conversations that had taken place between Magnus and Lorgar in the aftermath of Erebus's death. "Your Emperor's policy of denying their existence, while well-intentioned, leaves your people vulnerable to subtle corruption precisely because they lack the knowledge necessary to recognize and resist such influences." The ambassador gestured to a series of holographic displays that materialized in the chamber's center, showing images that would have been impossible to capture through conventional means. The projections depicted battles that had taken place not in the material realm, but in dimensions adjacent to normal reality, where the laws of physics bent to accommodate forces that existed beyond mortal comprehension. "The entities you call chaos gods are parasites," Noel continued, his voice taking on the cadence of one imparting fundamental truths. "They feed upon emotion, particularly the extreme emotions generated by warfare, despair, ambition, and excess. Every act of violence in your Great Crusade provides them with sustenance. Every world burned in the name of compliance strengthens their hold upon reality." Horus felt ice form in his enhanced circulatory system as he contemplated the implications of this revelation. The Great Crusade, humanity's greatest achievement and the foundation of the Imperium's expansion across the galaxy, was simultaneously feeding the very entities that sought mankind's destruction. Every victory won in the Emperor's name, every world brought into compliance through force of arms, was providing psychic nourishment to beings whose ultimate goal was the corruption of everything they had built. "Then our very success works against us," Horus said, his voice carrying the weight of cosmic irony. "The more worlds we conquer, the stronger our enemies become. The greater our triumphs, the more we feed the forces that would see us destroyed." "Not necessarily," Noel replied, offering hope in the form of ancient wisdom. "The entities feed upon extreme emotion, but they are weakened by knowledge, cooperation, and the kind of spiritual strength that comes from understanding rather than blind faith. A civilization that recognizes their nature and takes appropriate precautions can continue to grow and prosper while denying them the sustenance they require." The Inter-X ambassador activated another series of displays, these showing technological marvels that had been developed specifically to combat the influence of otherworldly entities, weapons that fired not bolt shells or laser beams, but concentrated bursts of purified psychic energy, armor that incorporated protective wards directly into its molecular structure. Most impressive of all, shielding systems that could create zones of reality where the normal laws of physics were so firmly enforced that demonic manifestation became impossible. "We offer this knowledge freely," Noel said, his words carrying weight that transcended mere diplomatic courtesy, not as trade goods or bargaining chips, but as the shared inheritance of humanity in all its forms. The threat we face transcends the boundaries of individual civilizations or political systems. Either we stand together against the darkness, or we fall separately into the abyss. The offer represented something unprecedented in the history of human expansion, the first time that one branch of mankind had offered to freely share its greatest achievements with another. Yet it also carried implications that would fundamentally transform the nature of the Great Crusade itself, shifting it from a campaign of conquest to a collaborative effort aimed at defending humanity against threats that existed beyond the material realm. Captain Garviel Loken of the Lunar Wolves stepped forward, his expression carrying the thoughtful consideration that had made him one of Horus's most trusted advisors. "What assurance do we have that this knowledge will not be turned against us? The technologies you describe could be as dangerous in the wrong hands as they are beneficial when properly employed. The same assurance that we have in sharing this intelligence with you," Noel replied, his tone carrying respect for the question even as he challenged its underlying assumptions. Trust, backed by necessity and mutual benefit. The entities we fight do not distinguish between Imperium and Intrex, between your Emperor and our Council of Lords. To them, we are all sources of sustenance, all potential servants to be corrupted and consumed. Horus considered the ambassador's words carefully, weighing the unprecedented opportunity against the risks inherent in any alliance between civilizations that had developed along such different paths. The decision he made here would echo through the centuries, potentially determining whether humanity's expansion continued through the blood-soaked path of endless conquest or evolved into something more sustainable and ultimately more powerful. The corruption of Erebus and his network was exposed before it could reach fruition, Horus said slowly, his words carrying the weight of historical significance. Magnus the Red and Lorgar have already begun sharing their knowledge of these entities with other Primarchs. Perhaps it is time for the Imperium to acknowledge that some threats cannot be fought through force of arms alone. The War Master turned to face his own delegation, measuring their reactions to the momentous decision that was taking shape in his enhanced mind. These were men who had spent their entire lives prosecuting wars of conquest, who had been trained to view any non-imperial human civilization as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a potential ally to be courted. "I propose a formal alliance," Horus declared, his voice carrying the authority that had made him the Emperor's chosen representative among his sons. "The Intrex will share their knowledge of anti-chaos technologies and techniques, while the Imperium will provide military support for the establishment of protected zones where such technologies can be developed and deployed." The proposal sent ripples of shock through both delegations, representing a fundamental shift in imperial policy that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Yet the revelation of how close Lorgar had come to corruption, combined with the evidence of how far Erebus's network had spread, created a context where such unprecedented cooperation became not just advisable but essential. "The Emperor will need to approve any formal alliance," cautioned Malkador's representative, a political aide whose presence spoke to the significance that Terra placed upon these negotiations. Such an agreement would represent a departure from established imperial doctrine that requires the highest level of authorization. "Then we will seek that authorization," Horus replied, with the confidence of one who had never been denied by his father when the stakes were sufficiently high. "The corruption we have uncovered represents a threat to the very foundation of everything the Emperor has built. If the Intrex possess knowledge that can help us defend against such threats, then allying with them becomes not just an option, but an imperative." The negotiations that followed lasted for weeks, as representatives from both civilizations worked to establish frameworks for cooperation that had never before been attempted in human history. Technical specifications were shared and analyzed, military protocols were established for joint operations, and communication networks were designed to ensure that intelligence regarding chaos activities could be disseminated rapidly across both territories. Most importantly, plans were laid for the establishment of fortified research stations at key points throughout human space, facilities where the combined knowledge of both civilizations could be focused on developing ever more effective weapons against the entities that sought humanity's destruction. The Eye of Terror, that festering wound in reality where the forces of chaos were strongest, would be contained rather than ignored, surrounded by monitoring stations and defensive installations that would prevent any large-scale incursion into the material realm. The alliance that emerged from these negotiations would be remembered as one of the most significant diplomatic achievements in human history, the moment when two branches of mankind chose cooperation over conquest and knowledge over ignorance. Yet it was also something more, the first step in the creation of a truly galactic civilization capable of defending itself against threats that transcended the boundaries of normal reality. As the Intrex delegation prepared to depart for their home territories, carrying with them the formal documents that would bind their civilizations together in common cause, Horus reflected on how different the galaxy might have been if Erebus had succeeded in his plans. The theft of the Anathem Blade, the corruption of Lorgar, the fall of the Lunar Wolves themselves, all of these catastrophes had been averted by the timely intervention of those who recognized corruption for what it truly was. "The future remains uncertain," Noel said, as he prepared to return to his own ships. "But for the first time in millennia, humanity faces that uncertainty united rather than divided. Whatever challenges await us among the stars, we will meet them together." The words carried weight that transcended mere diplomatic courtesy, representing a fundamental shift in humanity's approach to its place in the galaxy. The Great Crusade would continue, but it would no longer be a campaign of conquest driven by the assumption that all non-imperial humans were enemies to be destroyed. Instead, it would become something unprecedented, a collaborative effort to build a civilization capable of defending itself against threats that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. The alliance was forged, the knowledge shared, and the foundation laid for a future that neither civilization could have achieved alone. The darkness still pressed against the boundaries of human space, but for the first time, it faced opponents who understood its nature and possessed the tools necessary to fight back. The war against chaos had entered a new phase, and humanity was no longer fighting blind. Chapter 9. The Emperor's Revelation. The Imperial Palace rose from the surface of Terra like a mountain carved from dreams and ambition, its golden spires reaching toward the stars with architectural audacity that spoke of a civilization that had transcended the merely mortal. Within its deepest chambers, where the accumulated wisdom of humanity's greatest ruler was housed in archives that contained the secrets of ages, a gathering was taking place that would reshape the destiny of the galaxy itself. The throne room had been sealed against all intrusion, save for those whose presence was deemed essential to the discussion of truths that few minds could bear to contemplate. The Emperor of mankind stood before the golden throne, his magnificent form radiating power that transcended the merely physical. For 10,000 years of planning and a lifetime of careful manipulation, he had maintained the fiction that gods and supernatural entities were nothing more than superstition. Yet the events on Cor Secundus had forced his hand, exposing truths that could no longer be hidden behind the comfortable certainties of the imperial truth. The death of Erebus, the corruption narrowly averted, the alliance with the Interrex, all of these developments demanded a fundamental re-evaluation of humanity's approach to the cosmic forces that sought its destruction. Magnus knelt before his father, his single eye blazing with knowledge that had been purchased at the cost of innocence. Beside him, Lorgar maintained the same position of respectful attention, though his golden features bore the marks of shame that would never entirely fade from his noble countenance. Both Primarchs had been fundamentally changed by their exposure to the entities that dwelt in the warp's darkest regions, transformed from warriors who fought in ignorance to generals who understood the true nature of the enemy they faced. "My sons," the Emperor began, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated not merely with the ear, but with the very essence of human consciousness. The time for careful deception has passed. What you have witnessed, what you have fought, what you have narrowly escaped represents the greatest threat that humanity has ever faced. The entities that sought to corrupt Lorgar, that whispered to Erebus through the warrior lodges, that even now press against the boundaries of reality seeking entry into our realm. These are not mere warp phantoms or psychic echoes. The revelation hung in the air like thunder, rolling across a storm-darkened sky, confirming what both Primarchs had suspected, but had hesitated to voice. The imperial truth, the fundamental doctrine upon which the Great Crusade had been built, was not complete truth, but rather a necessary lie, designed to protect humanity from forces that fed upon recognition and worship. The beings that the ancient peoples called gods are parasites, the Emperor continued, his golden gaze sweeping across his sons with intensity that could have melted lesser minds. They feed upon emotion, particularly the extreme emotions generated by warfare, despair, ambition, and excess. Every act of violence committed in ignorance strengthens them. Every prayer offered in desperation provides them with sustenance. Every moment of unchecked passion opens doorways through which they can pour their influence into the material realm. Magnus felt pieces of cosmic truth clicking into place within his enhanced intellect, forming a picture of reality that was both terrifying and oddly reassuring. The entities he had encountered in his explorations of the warp were not invincible cosmic forces, but rather predators that could be understood, anticipated, and ultimately defeated by those with sufficient knowledge and will. Then the Great Crusade itself feeds them, Lorgar said, his voice carrying the weight of terrible understanding. Every world we bring to compliance through force of arms, every population that suffers under the weight of conquest, every moment of triumph or despair generated by our expansion provides these entities with the psychic energy they require to grow stronger. Indeed, the Emperor acknowledged, his expression carrying approval for his son's intellectual courage even as it reflected the burden of cosmic irony. Yet the alternative to expansion is stagnation, and stagnation leads inevitably to decay and ultimate destruction. The entities that seek our corruption are patient beyond mortal comprehension. They would be content to let humanity wither in isolation, while they fed upon the despair of a dying species. The Emperor gestured to the walls around them, where murals depicted the glory of human expansion across the galaxy, alongside more abstract representations of forces that existed beyond the boundaries of normal perception. The artwork was ancient, predating the unification wars by millennia, yet it spoke to truths that transcended the limitations of any single era or civilization. The Webway project represents more than mere technological advancement, the Emperor revealed, his words carrying weight that transformed understanding of humanity's greatest undertaking. It is designed to create a network of protected passages through dimensions adjacent to normal space, allowing for faster-than-light travel without exposure to the entities that dwell in the warp's deeper regions. Magnus straightened from his kneeling position, his enhanced intellect immediately grasping the implications of this revelation. The massive undertaking beneath the Imperial Palace, the project that had consumed vast resources and decades of the Emperor's personal attention, was not merely about creating a more efficient form of interstellar travel. It was about freeing humanity entirely from dependence upon the realm where the Chaos entities held dominion. The Eldar accomplished something similar in the distant past, the Emperor continued, though their civilization ultimately fell to the very excesses that gave birth to the youngest and most dangerous of the warp entities. Their webway still exists, a vast network of tunnels through dimensions that the parasites cannot fully penetrate. By gaining access to this network and expanding it to serve human needs, we can create a civilization that is effectively immune to the subtle corruption that has claimed so many species before us. The scope of the Emperor's vision was breathtaking in its ambition, representing a plan that spanned not merely centuries, but millennia. Yet it also revealed the desperate urgency that drove his actions, the knowledge that humanity stood balanced on the edge of a precipice that had already claimed countless civilizations across the galaxy's long history. The corruption of Erebus nearly destroyed this possibility, the Emperor said, his gaze focusing upon Lorgar with intensity that carried both judgment and forgiveness. A corrupted Primarch, particularly one whose genetic template is tied to faith and belief, would have become a nexus through which the entities could have poured their influence into every corner of the Imperium. Your fall would have triggered a cascade of corruption that could have transformed the Great Crusade itself into a weapon against everything we have built. Lorgar felt the weight of catastrophe averted, pressing upon his enhanced consciousness, the knowledge of how close he had come to becoming the instrument of humanity's destruction. Yet beneath the shame and horror lay something else. Determination to ensure that such corruption never again came so close to success. "What would you have us do, Father?" Lorgar asked, his voice carrying the fervor of one seeking redemption through service. "How can we combat an enemy that feeds upon the very emotions and actions that define human nature? How do we fight beings that grow stronger through the violence necessary to defend ourselves against them?" "Through knowledge," the Emperor replied, his words echoing the wisdom that Magnus and the Intrix had already shared. "Through cooperation rather than conquest where possible. Through the cultivation of spiritual strength that comes from understanding rather than blind faith. And through the creation of institutional safeguards that can detect and counter corruption before it can take root." The Emperor activated a series of holographic displays that filled the chamber with images drawn from across human space, showing the locations of Legion fleets, the positions of compliance operations, and the vast network of supply lines and communication relays that kept the Great Crusade functioning. Overlaying these mundane tactical displays were patterns of energy that spoke to more esoteric concerns: warp currents, psychic resonances, and the subtle traces that marked where otherworldly influences had attempted to gain footholds in reality. "New chaplain orders will be created within every legion," the Emperor declared, his words carrying the weight of absolute command. "These will not be the corrupted institutions that Erebus perverted, but rather organizations dedicated to detecting and countering the specific threat posed by warp entities. They will be trained in techniques developed in cooperation with our new allies among the Interrex, armed with weapons designed specifically to combat demonic manifestation, and granted authority to investigate any suspected corruption, regardless of rank or position." The implications were staggering, representing a fundamental transformation of the Astartes' organizational structure that would place spiritual vigilance on equal footing with tactical excellence. Yet both Primarchs recognized the necessity of such measures, understanding that conventional military training was insufficient preparation for the kind of warfare they now faced. These new chaplains will answer directly to their Primarchs rather than to any intermediary authority, the Emperor continued, his gaze moving between Magnus and Lorgar with intensity that spoke to lessons learned from recent events. The chain of command that allowed Erebus to operate undetected will be restructured to ensure that no single individual can accumulate sufficient authority to corrupt an entire legion's spiritual guidance. Magnus nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in distributing authority in ways that made systematic corruption more difficult to achieve. Yet he also understood that such measures were only as effective as the individuals charged with implementing them, and that the new chaplains would require training that went far beyond anything currently available within Imperial institutions. "The Interrex have agreed to provide instructors," the Emperor said, as if reading his son's thoughts. "Their millennia of experience fighting the entities you encountered will be invaluable in developing the techniques and protocols necessary to protect our forces from similar corruption. Exchange programs will be established, allowing our most promising candidates to study their methods while their experts help train our new chaplain orders." The mention of formal cooperation with non-imperial humans represented a departure from established doctrine that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Yet the threat posed by chaos entities transcended the boundaries of conventional political philosophy, creating necessities that overrode ideological preferences. "Beyond these organizational changes," the Emperor continued, "authorization is hereby granted for the development of weapons and fortifications specifically designed to combat warp entities. The technologies that the Interrex have shared will be combined with our own research into psychic phenomena, creating armaments that can function effectively against targets that exist beyond the boundaries of normal space." The Emperor gestured toward a series of technical schematics that appeared among the holographic displays, showing weapon designs that incorporated elements of both Imperial engineering and Interrex innovation. Bolt rounds embedded with psychically reactive materials that could disrupt demonic manifestation. Armor plating that incorporated protective wards directly into its molecular structure. Most impressive of all, fortress designs that could create zones of enforced reality where the normal laws of physics were so firmly established that otherworldly entities could not maintain coherent existence. The fortification of key strategic points throughout human space will begin immediately, the Emperor declared, his words carrying the weight of a commitment that would reshape the galaxy's defensive infrastructure. The Eye of Terror will be contained rather than ignored, surrounded by monitoring stations and defensive installations that can detect and respond to any large-scale incursion from the warp. Trade routes will be protected by way stations equipped with the new anti-chaos technologies, ensuring that corruption cannot spread along the same pathways that carry legitimate commerce. The scope of the undertaking was breathtaking, representing a level of coordination and resource commitment that would rival the Great Crusade itself. Yet both Primarchs understood that the alternative to such comprehensive defensive measures was the gradual corruption of everything they had built, followed by humanity's transformation into a weapon against itself. "There is one final matter that must be addressed," the Emperor said, his expression growing more grave as he prepared to share knowledge that even his enhanced sons might find difficult to bear. "The entities that sought to corrupt Lorgar are not unique threats, but rather representatives of cosmic forces that have existed since the first thinking beings achieved sufficient complexity to generate psychic emanations. They have corrupted and consumed countless civilizations across the galaxy's history, and they will continue to exist long after humanity has either achieved transcendence or fallen to their influence." The revelation placed humanity's struggle within a cosmic context that dwarfed even the grandest ambitions of the Great Crusade, suggesting that the war they fought was not merely for the conquest of territory, but for the right to exist as a free species in a galaxy where freedom was a rare and precious commodity. "Yet we possess advantages that previous civilizations lacked," the Emperor continued, his words carrying hope alongside cosmic horror. "Unity of purpose, technological sophistication, and now knowledge of the enemy's true nature. Most importantly, we have time, the luxury of generations in which to build defenses, refine techniques, and prepare for challenges that our predecessors faced in ignorance and isolation." The Emperor's gaze swept across his sons with intensity that spoke to the absolute importance of what they had accomplished and what they would need to achieve in the years ahead. The death of Erebus had been more than the elimination of a single traitor. It had been the prevention of a cascade that could have transformed the galaxy's greatest hope into its ultimate nightmare. "The future remains uncertain," the Emperor concluded. "But for the first time since the entities of chaos began their infiltration of human civilization, they face opponents who understand their nature and possess the knowledge necessary to fight back. The war they have waged in shadows will be brought into the light, where it can be fought by warriors who know both the cost of defeat and the price of victory." The audience was concluded, but the work it had set in motion would continue for centuries. New institutions would be created, new technologies developed, new alliances forged in the crucible of shared necessity. The Imperium would emerge from this transformation stronger than ever before, prepared for challenges that transcended the boundaries of conventional warfare. The Emperor had spoken, and the galaxy would never be the same. Chapter 10. The Lost and Damned. The asteroids of the Maelstrom's edge drifted through space like tombstones, marking the graves of civilizations that had ventured too close to the warp storm's hungry embrace. Among these barren rocks, hidden in facilities carved from stone and metal that bore no resemblance to imperial architecture, the remnants of Erebus's network had gathered to plot their survival in a galaxy that no longer welcomed their twisted faith. They were the lost and damned, space marines who had progressed too far down the path of corruption to ever find redemption, cultists whose minds had been reshaped by exposure to entities that existed beyond mortal comprehension. Brother Captain Kol Badar of the Word Bearers knelt before an altar that would have horrified any loyal servant of the Imperium, its surface slick with offerings that still steamed in the recycled air of the asteroid facility. His armor bore the scars of battles fought not against the enemies of mankind, but against those who had once been his brothers, the loyalist forces that hunted him and his followers across the darker regions of human space. The grey ceramite that had once proclaimed his allegiance to Lorgar now bore symbols that spoke to older loyalties, geometric patterns that hurt the mind to perceive directly. "The first chaplain is dead," Badar whispered to the shadows that danced at the edge of his vision, entities that existed in the spaces between heartbeats and fed upon the despair of those who had sacrificed everything for power that proved hollow when finally grasped. "Erebus, who showed us the truth behind the imperial lies, who opened our eyes to the reality of cosmic forces that dwarf the Emperor's petty ambitions. His voice no longer guides us through the warp's currents." The silence that followed was not empty, but pregnant with the weight of otherworldly attention, as entities that had invested decades in the corruption of imperial forces contemplated the sudden disruption of their carefully laid plans. The death of their primary agent within the word-bearers had severed connections that could not be easily re-established, leaving their mortal servants isolated and vulnerable in ways that few of them fully comprehended. Yet isolation bred desperation, and desperation could be shaped into a weapon that cut both ways. The surviving cultists and corrupted space marines who had gathered in this place represented the scattered remnants of a network that had once threatened the very foundation of imperial civilization. Individually, they were broken fragments of their former selves, space marines whose genetic programming warred against the alien influences that had reshaped their consciousness. Together, they were still dangerous enough to pose a threat that could not be ignored by those who understood the true nature of the enemy they faced. "We are not abandoned," declared Dark Apostle Kol Marduk, a word-bearer whose fall to corruption had begun long before Erebus had ever whispered the names of forbidden gods. His scarred features bore the marks of rituals that had cost him much, but granted him insights that ordinary minds couldn't achieve. "The gods we serve are eternal, patient beyond mortal comprehension. They have invested too much in our ascension to simply cast us aside, because a single servant has fallen." The words carried weight among the assembled renegades, offering hope to warriors who had sacrificed everything in pursuit of promises that now seemed as distant as the stars themselves. Yet beneath the bravado lay uncertainty, the growing awareness that they faced enemies who understood their nature and possessed the knowledge necessary to fight back effectively. The fortress asteroid shook as something massive struck its outer defenses, sending tremors through the facility that spoke of forces beyond conventional weaponry. Alarm klaxons wailed through corridors that had been carved with no regard for imperial architectural standards, their discordant tones mixing with the chanted prayers of cultists who sought protection from entities that cared nothing for mortal survival. "Imperial forces," Badar snarled, his enhanced hearing detecting the distinctive signatures of drop pods breaching the asteroid's atmosphere. "They have found us at last. The new chaplains and their witch hunters have finally tracked us to our sanctuary." The assault that followed would be remembered as the first battle of what imperial historians would later call the Cleansing Wars, a series of campaigns designed to root out the corruption that had survived Erebus's death and eliminate the threat posed by space marines who had fallen too far to ever be redeemed. The forces that struck the asteroid facility were unlike anything that had been seen before in imperial service. Warriors trained specifically to combat enemies that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional reality. Captain Mordian Rask of the newly formed Ordo Malleus led the assault, his black armor bearing symbols that had been developed through careful study of Inter-X techniques for warding against supernatural influence. Behind him came warriors drawn from multiple legions, all volunteers who had demonstrated both the psychological stability necessary to fight otherworldly enemies and the spiritual strength required to resist corruption, even when exposed to its most concentrated forms. "Target acquired," Rask voxed to his strike force as they breached the facility's inner sanctum, his enhanced senses cataloguing the evidence of corruption that permeated every surface of the chamber. Multiple hostiles bearing the taint of warp exposure. Rules of engagement are in effect. No quarter given, no prisoners taken. These are no longer our brothers. The battle that erupted within the asteroid's carved corridors was unlike anything in the annals of Imperial warfare, a clash between forces that represented fundamentally different approaches to the question of humanity's place in a hostile universe. The corrupted renegades fought with desperate fury, their tactics shaped by insights gained through communion with entities that viewed mortal conflict as entertainment rather than struggle for survival. Yet they faced opponents who had been trained specifically to counter such advantages, warriors whose weapons and armor incorporated technologies designed to function effectively against targets that existed beyond normal space. Kol Badar met Captain Rask in single combat at the center of the facility's blasphemous shrine, their weapons clashing with forces that sent ripples through dimensions adjacent to reality itself. The Word-Bearer's blade had been forged through rituals that bound it to otherworldly patrons, granting it the ability to cut through both armor and soul with equal effectiveness. Yet Rask's weapon was equally extraordinary, its edge inscribed with protective formulae developed through cooperation between Imperial tech adepts and Interrex artificers. "You serve a lie," Badar gasped as their weapons locked together, the competing energies they channeled creating auroras of impossible color in the air around them. The Emperor promises transcendence, but delivers only stagnation. The gods we worship offer evolution beyond the limitations of mortal flesh. "Evolution into slavery," Rask replied, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of one whose faith had been tested in the crucible of cosmic truth. "You mistake corruption for growth, degradation for advancement. What you call gods are parasites that feed upon sentient life, offering power in exchange for the very qualities that make existence worth preserving." The philosophical debate was settled through violence, as such debates always were when the stakes transcended the merely intellectual. Rask's blade found its mark through defenses that had been corrupted beyond the point where human reflexes could sustain them, cutting through Badar's enhanced physiology with an efficiency that spoke to the effectiveness of the new anti-chaos weaponry. Yet the victory came at a cost that would be repeated countless times in the campaigns that followed. 3 of Rask's warriors fell to weapons that channeled forces beyond mortal comprehension, their gene seed lost to corruption so profound that even the purification rituals developed by the Interrex could not cleanse it. Each death was a reminder that the enemy they faced was not merely hostile, but antithetical to the very concept of ordered existence. The success of the asteroid raid marked the beginning of a systematic campaign that would span decades, as Imperial forces hunted down the scattered remnants of Erebus's network across the darker regions of human space. The corrupted space marines who had survived their patron's death proved to be resourceful and dangerous opponents, their desperation driving them to tactics that pushed the boundaries of what even chaos entities would normally sanction. Some fled into the eye of terror itself, seeking sanctuary among the demon worlds, where reality bent to accommodate forces that existed beyond mortal comprehension. Others gathered in hidden bases scattered throughout the galaxy's spiral arms, plotting revenge against the Imperium that had cast them out. A few attempted to establish their own power bases among primitive human populations, setting themselves up as god-kings over worlds that lacked the technological sophistication to resist their corrupted gifts. Yet for the first time in the galaxy's history, such corruption faced systematic opposition from forces that understood its nature and possessed the tools necessary to combat it effectively. The new chaplain orders worked in coordination with military commanders who had been trained in anti-chaos warfare, creating a network of vigilance that made it increasingly difficult for renegade forces to operate undetected. "The Emperor has authorized the Purification Crusade," declared Horus, during a gathering of Primarchs that would have been impossible under the old dispensation of ignorance and secrecy. A coordinated campaign to eliminate the remaining corruption from human space and establish monitoring stations around known warp storm regions. The Eye of Terror will no longer be treated as a forbidden zone to be avoided, but as a cancer that must be contained. The authorization represented a fundamental shift in imperial strategy, transforming the Great Crusade from a campaign of expansion into a war of purification that would span generations. The forces assembled for this undertaking dwarfed anything that had been seen since the Unification Wars, drawing upon resources from across human space and incorporating technologies that had never before been deployed on such a scale. Magnus the Red volunteered to lead the assault on the Eye of Terror itself, his psychic abilities making him uniquely qualified to navigate the reality storms that surrounded the galaxy's greatest wound. Beside him stood Lorgar, seeking redemption through service against the very entities that had once sought to claim his soul. Together, they represented something unprecedented. Primarchs working in perfect cooperation against an enemy that threatened the very foundation of human civilization. The campaign that followed would be remembered as one of the bloodiest in Imperial history, a series of battles fought not merely for territory, but for the right of ordered existence to continue in a universe where chaos was always seeking to reassert its dominion. The losses were staggering, measured not just in ships and warriors, but in gene seed lines that were lost to corruption, so profound that even death could not purify it. Yet the campaign also achieved something that had never before been attempted successfully: the systematic containment of a major warp storm region and the establishment of permanent monitoring stations within the Eye of Terror itself. The fortress worlds that were constructed around the storm's perimeter became bastions of ordered reality, their very existence serving as bulwarks against the forces that sought to pour forth from dimensions where sanity was a foreign concept. "The corruption is contained," Magnus reported to the Emperor during a communication that stretched across vast distances of both space and dimensional barriers. "The Eye of Terror has been sealed, its major exit points monitored and defended. The demon worlds within still harbor entities that pose a threat, but they can no longer project their influence into the material realm without detection." The success came at a price that would echo through the centuries, reshaping imperial culture in ways that few could have anticipated. The knowledge that corruption could strike at the very heart of the Space Marine legions created a paranoia that would never entirely fade, a constant vigilance that transformed the Imperium from a civilization of bold expansion into one of careful preparation. Yet it also created something that had never before existed: a human society that was prepared for the cosmic forces it would inevitably face as it spread across the galaxy. The lost and damned had been hunted to extinction, their corruption purged from human space through violence that had cost more than any previous campaign in Imperial history. Yet their elimination had also proven that the entities they served were not invincible, that corruption could be fought and defeated by those with sufficient knowledge and will to pay the necessary price. The war against chaos had entered a new phase, one where the forces of order possessed both the understanding and the weapons necessary to fight back effectively. The galaxy was a safer place because of what had been accomplished, but it was also a more dangerous one, as the entities that dwelt in the warp's depths began to realize that humanity was no longer the easy prey they had assumed it would always remain. The future would bring new challenges and new threats, but for the first time since the entities of chaos had begun their assault on human civilization, those challenges would be met by warriors who understood what they faced and were prepared to pay any price necessary to ensure that ordered existence continued to flourish among the stars. Chapter 11. The War Master's Burden. The command deck of the Vengeful Spirit had been transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to those who remembered the early days of the Great Crusade, when each legion operated in isolation and cooperation between gene brothers was the exception rather than the rule. Holographic displays filled the vast chamber with tactical information drawn from across human space, showing the positions of fleets that represented not conquest through division, but unity through shared purpose. The banners that hung from the vaulted ceiling bore not just the symbols of the lunar wolves, but the heraldry of a dozen other legions, creating a visual testament to the unprecedented cooperation that had emerged from humanity's darkest hour. Horus stood before the central display, his magnificent form bearing the weight of responsibility that came with coordinating the largest military undertaking in human history. Yet the burden he carried was different from what it had once been, shaped not by the isolation of supreme command, but by the knowledge that he served as first among equals in a brotherhood that had been forged in the crucible of cosmic truth. The War Master's authority remained absolute, but it was exercised now in consultation with gene brothers, whose counsel he valued not merely for their tactical expertise, but for their shared understanding of the threats that lurked beyond the boundaries of conventional reality. "The compliance of Xerxes Prime proceeds ahead of schedule," reported Captain Abaddon, his voice carrying satisfaction that spoke to victories won through cooperation rather than mere force of arms. The Interex advisor's predictions about the population's spiritual resilience have proven accurate. Their exposure to warp storms over the past millennium has created a natural resistance to the kind of subtle corruption that might have made them vulnerable to infiltration. The mention of Interex involvement in Imperial compliance operations would have been unthinkable under the old dispensation, when humanity's expansion was driven by the assumption that all non-imperial civilizations were obstacles to be overcome. Yet the alliance forged in the aftermath of Erebus's death had fundamentally transformed the nature of the Great Crusade itself, shifting it from a campaign of pure conquest to a collaborative effort aimed at protecting human civilization from threats that transcended planetary boundaries. "Their knowledge continues to prove invaluable," Horus acknowledged, his gaze sweeping across displays that showed the locations where joint Imperial Interex research stations were developing ever more sophisticated defenses against supernatural corruption. "Each world we bring into compliance is strengthened by techniques that our ancestors could barely have imagined. We build not just an empire, but a fortress against forces that have consumed countless civilizations throughout the galaxy's history." The transformation in Imperial methodology was visible in every aspect of the ongoing expansion. Compliance fleets now included not just military forces, but teams of specialists trained in detecting and countering otherworldly influence. Worlds were brought into the Imperial fold through processes that emphasized education and cooperation rather than simple subjugation, creating populations that understood the cosmic context of their integration and were prepared to contribute to humanity's collective defense. Horus moved to the chamber's viewing port, where the stars wheeled in patterns that had once seemed random, but now revealed the underlying structure that connected all human territories in a vast web of mutual support. The isolation that had characterized the early Great Crusade, when each Primarch pursued his own vision of conquest, had given way to coordination that made the Imperium exponentially stronger than the sum of its parts. "Sometimes I wonder what might have happened," Horus said, his voice carrying the weight of contemplation that came with understanding how close they had all come to a very different fate. If Erebus had succeeded in his corruption of Lorgar, if the network he built had reached fruition, if the entities he served had gained the foothold they sought within our ranks, the question hung in the air like a spectre of possibilities that had been narrowly averted, scenarios that would have transformed the Great Crusade from humanity's greatest triumph into its ultimate nightmare. The corruption of a single Primarch could have cascaded through the genetic bonds that connected him to his sons, creating a cancer that would have spread throughout the Imperium before its true nature was understood. "The galaxy would have burned," Abaddon replied, with the certainty of one who had studied the intelligence gathered from captured cultists and corrupted renegades. Brother would have fought brother. The Emperor's greatest weapons would have been turned against everything they were created to protect, and humanity would have destroyed itself, while the entities that orchestrated our downfall fed upon the carnage. The assessment was not hyperbole, but sober analysis based on evidence gathered during the Purification Crusade, when Imperial forces had confronted the full scope of what Erebus's network had been designed to achieve. The corrupted space marines they had hunted through the galaxy's darker regions represented merely the beginning of what could have been a transformation that would have left nothing recognizable of human civilization. "Instead, we stand united," Horus said, turning from the viewing port to face displays that showed the unprecedented coordination between forces that had once operated in isolation. Magnus and Lorgar work together to develop new defenses against psychic corruption. Russ and the Khan coordinate hunts for remaining cultist cells. Gilliman and Dawn collaborate on fortress designs that incorporate both Imperial engineering and Interrex innovations. The cooperation between Primarchs represented something that had never before been achieved in the history of the Great Crusade, a unity of purpose that transcended the personality conflicts and philosophical differences that had once created friction within the Imperial command structure. The shared knowledge of how close they had come to cosmic disaster had forged bonds between gene brothers that might otherwise have remained distant or even adversarial. "The Emperor's vision approaches realization," Horus continued, his words carrying the weight of historical significance. "A galaxy united under human rule, defended against threats both material and supernatural, prepared for challenges that previous civilizations faced in ignorance and isolation. Yet it is a vision achieved through cooperation rather than conquest, through knowledge rather than ignorance, through unity rather than domination." The transformation in imperial philosophy was visible in every aspect of the ongoing expansion, from the educational programs that prepared newly compliant populations for their role in galactic civilization, to the research initiatives that pushed the boundaries of human understanding in fields that ranged from conventional technology to the manipulation of forces that existed beyond normal space. Most significantly, the relationships between the Space Marine legions had been fundamentally altered by their shared experience of fighting an enemy that threatened not just their individual survival, but the very concept of ordered existence. The rivalry and competition that had once characterized interactions between different gene lines had given way to collaboration that made each legion stronger and more effective. "Report from the Thousand Suns Expeditionary Fleet," announced the communications officer, his voice carrying the efficiency that marked all Imperial operations in this new era of unprecedented coordination. "Primarch Magnus requests permission to share technical specifications for the new psychic shielding arrays with Legion Forge Masters. Initial testing suggests a 30% improvement in effectiveness against supernatural manifestation." "Granted immediately," Horus replied without hesitation, recognizing that the old protocols of technological secrecy between legions had become not just obsolete, but counterproductive in the face of threats that required coordinated response. Distribute the specifications to all Legion commands and forward copies to our Interx technical liaisons for evaluation and potential improvement. The exchange would have been impossible under the previous system, where each Legion jealously guarded its innovations and cooperation was limited to the tactical level. Yet the revelation of how vulnerable they had all been to corruption that transcended Legion boundaries had created a recognition that their survival depended upon shared knowledge and mutual support. Additional report from the Word-Bearers contingent operating in the Ghoul Stars, the officer continued. Primarch Lorgar reports successful establishment of monitoring stations around 3 previously uncharted warp storm systems. No evidence of organized supernatural activity, but the stations will provide early warning if conditions change. The mention of Lorgar's involvement in anti-chaos operations carried particular significance, representing the complete transformation of a Primarch who had come within moments of becoming the architect of humanity's destruction. The shame that drove his current dedication to protecting the Imperium from supernatural threats had become a source of strength that benefited all of human civilization. Lorgar's commitment to redemption through service honors both him and the Legion he leads, Horus observed, his words carrying respect for a Gene brother who had faced the darkest temptation and emerged stronger for having resisted it. His understanding of the enemy's methods makes him uniquely qualified to develop countermeasures that protect not just his own sons, but all Imperial forces. The transformation of the Word-Bearers from a Legion vulnerable to corruption into humanity's most dedicated defenders against supernatural threat represented one of the most remarkable achievements of the new era. Their intimate knowledge of how chaos entities operated, gained through bitter experience of near corruption, had become a weapon that was turned against the very forces that had sought to claim them. The Webway project approaches another milestone, reported the strategic analysis officer, his voice carrying satisfaction that spoke to achievements that transcended mere military victory. The cooperation between Imperial tech adepts and Interx engineers has accelerated construction beyond original projections. Estimated completion of the core network has been moved forward by 3 decades. The acceleration of humanity's greatest undertaking represented perhaps the most significant benefit of the alliance that had emerged from Erebus's defeat. The combination of Imperial resources and Interx expertise had created possibilities that neither civilization could have achieved alone, transforming what had been a centuries-long project into something that might be completed within the lifetime of those who had begun it. When the Webway is complete, Horus said, his words carrying the weight of cosmic vision, humanity will possess something that no previous civilization has achieved, the ability to expand across the galaxy without exposure to the entities that dwell in the warp's deeper regions. We will be immune to the corruption that has claimed countless species throughout history. The prospect of such immunity represented the ultimate vindication of the path they had chosen, proof that cooperation and knowledge were more powerful weapons than conquest and ignorance, yet it also carried responsibilities that would test the character of human civilization for millennia to come. The burden we carry is heavier than conquest alone, Horus reflected, his gaze returning to the displays that showed the vast scope of their undertaking. We build not just for ourselves, but for generations yet unborn, creating a legacy that must endure against threats that span geological ages. Every decision we make echoes across the centuries. Every world we bring into compliance becomes part of a fortress that must stand against forces that are patient beyond mortal comprehension. The weight of such responsibility would have been crushing for a single individual, yet it was shared among gene brothers whose unity had been forged in the crucible of cosmic truth. The cooperation that had emerged from their shared brush with disaster created strength that transcended what any single Primarch could achieve in isolation. "Yet we do not carry this burden alone," Horus continued, his words acknowledging the unprecedented support network that had emerged from humanity's darkest hour. "We stand with allies whose knowledge complements our strength, guided by an emperor whose wisdom has been proven through trials that would have destroyed lesser civilizations. The galaxy may be vast and filled with ancient threats, but for the first time in its history, it faces a human civilization that understands what it confronts and is prepared to meet any challenge." The optimism in his words was not naive hope, but reasoned confidence, based on achievements that had transformed the impossible into the inevitable. The corruption that had nearly claimed Lorgar had been turned into strength. The network that had threatened the Imperium's foundation had been dismantled and replaced with cooperation that made all human civilization stronger. "The Great Crusade continues," Horus declared, his voice carrying the authority of one who spoke not just for his own forces, but for all humanity's defenders. Yet it is no longer a crusade of conquest, but one of protection, no longer driven by the need to dominate, but by the will to preserve. We build a galaxy fit for human habitation, defended against threats both known and unknown, prepared for challenges that our ancestors could not have imagined. The transformation was complete, the burden accepted, and the future secured through cooperation that had emerged from humanity's greatest trial. The War Master who had once stood alone now stood first among equals, leading a civilization that had learned to face the darkness together rather than separately. The galaxy stretched before them, vast and filled with wonders and dangers in equal measure. Yet for the first time in its history, humanity approached that immensity united in purpose, armed with knowledge, and prepared for whatever challenges awaited among the stars. The dream that had begun with the Emperor's vision of unified human civilization had become reality, stronger and more resilient than its creator had dared to hope. The future remained uncertain, but it would be faced by a species that understood its place in the cosmos and was determined to preserve that place against any threat. The burden was heavy, but it was shared, and in that sharing lay strength that no enemy, however ancient or powerful, could overcome. Chapter 12. The Dream Yet Stands. 50 years had passed since the death of Erebus in the ancient temple of Cor Secundus, 5 decades during which the galaxy had been transformed beyond recognition by forces that served creation rather than corruption. The Imperium that stretched across the stars bore little resemblance to the war-torn realm that might have emerged from a different timeline, one where brother fought brother and humanity's greatest weapons were turned against the very civilization they had been created to protect. Instead, the golden age that the Emperor had envisioned in his most optimistic projections had become reality, a testament to the power of cooperation over conquest and knowledge over ignorance. The Imperial Palace on Terra rose from the planet's surface like a monument to human achievement, its spires reaching toward stars that now belonged not to a single species, but to an alliance of civilizations that had learned to face the darkness together. The architecture had evolved over the decades, incorporating design elements that spoke to influences both familiar and foreign, as human creativity had been enriched through contact with societies that had developed along different paths toward the same fundamental goals. Within the palace's deepest chambers, where the accumulated wisdom of ages was housed in archives that contained knowledge drawn from across the galaxy's spiral arms, a gathering was taking place that would have been impossible under the old dispensation of secrecy and isolation. The council chamber had been expanded to accommodate not just the primarchs of the Space Marine legions, but representatives from the Interrex, delegates from newly allied human civilizations, and technical specialists whose expertise spanned fields that ranged from conventional engineering to the manipulation of forces that existed beyond normal space. The Emperor stood before the assembled company, his form radiating power that had been refined and focused through decades of preparation for the transformation that awaited. Yet his presence was no longer that of a distant ruler commanding from isolation, but rather of a teacher preparing his students for responsibilities that would soon fall entirely upon their shoulders. The time of direct governance was ending, replaced by something that transcended the limitations of mortal authority. "My sons," the Emperor began, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the fundamental frequencies of ordered reality itself, "the work is complete. The webway that will free humanity from dependence upon the warp has been finished, its passages secured against intrusion from entities that dwell in dimensions adjacent to normal space. The galaxy stands united, not through conquest, but through cooperation, defended not through ignorance, but through knowledge, prepared not for the wars of the past, but for the challenges of the future." The achievement represented the culmination of planning that had spanned millennia, the successful completion of humanity's greatest undertaking through collaboration that would have been impossible without the shared understanding that had emerged from their brush with cosmic disaster. Each Primarch had contributed expertise that made the whole exponentially greater than the sum of its parts, creating something that no single mind could have conceived or accomplished. Magnus stood among his gene brothers, his single eye reflecting satisfaction that came from seeing theoretical possibilities transformed into concrete reality. The psychic sciences that had once been regarded with suspicion had become the foundation for defenses that could protect human civilization from threats that transcended the material realm. His knowledge, combined with insights gained from Interrex archives and the bitter experience of fighting corruption, had created possibilities that previous generations could barely have imagined. "The Thousand Suns will maintain their vigil," Magnus declared, his words carrying the weight of responsibility accepted rather than obligation imposed. "The entities that sought to corrupt our brother Lorgar remain patient beyond mortal comprehension, waiting for moments of weakness when their influence might again find purchase within human civilization. Yet they will find us prepared, armed with knowledge that turns their own methods against them." Beside him, Lorgar maintained the posture of respectful attention that had characterized his bearing since the moment he had awakened from his near corruption to find himself surrounded by brothers who had risked everything to save his soul. The shame that had driven his initial dedication to redemption had evolved into something deeper and more sustainable, a commitment to protecting others from the temptation that had nearly claimed him. "The word-bearers stand as guardians against spiritual corruption," Lorgar added, his voice carrying the authority of one whose faith had been tested in the crucible of absolute darkness and emerged purified rather than destroyed. "Every world brought into imperial compliance receives education about the threats that exist beyond the material realm, preparation that will serve them well in the challenges that await among the stars." The transformation of the word-bearers from a legion vulnerable to corruption into humanity's most dedicated defenders against supernatural threat represented one of the most remarkable achievements of the new era. Their understanding of how otherworldly entities operated, gained through bitter experience of near damnation, had become a weapon that protected not just the Imperium, but all human civilization. Horus stepped forward, his bearing still carrying the authority of supreme command, yet tempered by the knowledge that he served as first among equals rather than ruler among subjects. The War Master's role had evolved over the decades, shifting from military commander to coordinator of efforts that spanned disciplines from conventional warfare to dimensional engineering. The Great Crusade enters its final phase, Horus announced, his words carrying the weight of historical significance. No longer driven by the need to conquer, but by the will to protect. No longer characterized by isolation between forces, but by cooperation that makes all participants stronger. The galaxy that our father envisioned, united under human guidance, yet enriched by contact with allied civilizations, has become reality. The reports that followed painted a picture of achievement that would have seemed impossible to those who remembered the early days when each legion operated in isolation and competition between gene brothers was the norm rather than the exception. Trade routes protected by joint Imperial Interrex patrols carried not just goods, but knowledge that benefited all participants. Research stations scattered throughout human space pushed the boundaries of understanding in fields that ranged from stellar engineering to the cultivation of psychic abilities that could serve creation rather than destruction. Most significantly, the monitoring networks that surrounded known warp storm regions had detected no major supernatural activity for over a decade, suggesting that the systematic containment efforts had achieved their intended effect. The Eye of Terror remained a wound in reality's fabric, but it was a wound that had been bandaged and sterilized, its influence contained within boundaries that were constantly monitored and regularly reinforced. The Webway project stands as testament to what becomes possible when diverse forms of knowledge are combined in pursuit of common goals, reported Perturabo, his voice carrying satisfaction that came from seeing theoretical designs transformed into structures that would endure for millennia. Imperial engineering, Interrex dimensional mathematics, and insights gained from our study of captured chaos artifacts have created something that transcends what any single civilization could have achieved. The network of passages that now connected major human settlements represented more than mere technological advancement. It was a transformation of humanity's relationship with the galaxy itself, freeing the species from dependence upon methods of travel that exposed them to entities whose influence had claimed countless civilizations throughout history. Travel through the Webway eliminates exposure to warp entities entirely, added Ferrus Manus, his mechanical augmentations interfacing directly with data streams that monitored the network's performance across vast distances. Colonization efforts can now proceed without the spiritual risks that once made expansion a gamble with humanity's soul. We build not just territory, but sanctuary. The implications were staggering, suggesting that human civilization could now expand across the galaxy without the constant threat of corruption that had limited previous efforts. Worlds could be settled and developed without concern for their proximity to warp storm regions. Trade could flourish without exposure to entities that fed upon the psychic emanations generated by commerce and communication. Yet perhaps the most significant transformation was visible not in technological achievement, but in the relationships between the Primarchs themselves. The rivalry and competition that had once characterized interactions between different gene lines had given way to collaboration that made each legion stronger and more effective. The shared experience of fighting an enemy that threatened not just their individual survival, but the very concept of ordered existence had forged bonds that transcended the personality conflicts and philosophical differences of the past. The Emperor's vision approaches its ultimate realization, observed Gilliman, his strategic mind encompassing the vast scope of what had been accomplished and what remained possible. Yet it is a realization achieved not through the domination of a single will, but through the cooperation of minds that complement rather than compete with one another. The comment drew nods of agreement from Gene brothers who had learned to value diversity of approach as strength rather than weakness, who understood that the challenges they faced required solutions that no single intellect could develop in isolation. "The time of direct governance ends," the Emperor declared, his words carrying weight that transcended mere political transition. "The Imperium that has emerged from humanity's trial by cosmic fire no longer requires the guidance of a single ruler, but rather the wisdom of many minds working in coordination toward shared goals. The transcendence that awaits will free consciousness from the limitations of material form, allowing for communion with forces that serve creation rather than destruction." The announcement had been anticipated for years, yet it still carried emotional weight that touched every individual present. The Emperor, who had guided humanity from its darkest age to its greatest triumph, would soon exist in a form that transcended the boundaries of physical reality, available for consultation and guidance, yet no longer bound by the necessities of direct command. "The Primarchs will assume collective responsibility for imperial governance," the Emperor continued, his gaze sweeping across sons who had proven themselves worthy of the trust being placed in them. Not as competing rulers seeking individual advantage, but as brothers united in purpose, each contributing unique strengths to challenges that require diverse approaches. The Emporium will be governed not by a single will, but by a council that represents the best qualities of human leadership. The transition represented something unprecedented in galactic history, the peaceful transfer of authority from a transcendent individual to a collective that had proven its ability to work together in pursuit of common goals. The cooperation that had emerged from their shared struggle against corruption would become the foundation for a form of governance that balanced individual expertise with unified purpose. "The vigilance must continue," warned the Emperor, his expression growing more grave as he addressed the eternal challenge that would face human civilization, regardless of its technological or political achievements. The entities that sought to corrupt Lorgar, that whispered to Erebus through the warrior lodges, that even now press against the boundaries of contained space, seeking new opportunities for infiltration, remain patient beyond mortal comprehension. They will wait for moments of weakness, for periods when prosperity breeds complacency or success generates pride that blinds its possessors to cosmic realities. The warning carried weight that touched every individual present, reminder that the price of freedom was eternal vigilance, and that the victory they had achieved created responsibilities that would be inherited by generations yet unborn. Yet for the first time in galactic history, the Emperor concluded, humanity faces those challenges prepared rather than vulnerable, united rather than divided, armed with knowledge rather than blinded by ignorance. The dream that began with the unification of Terra has been realized not just on a planetary scale, but across the galaxy itself. Human civilization stands ready for whatever trials await among the stars. The gathering concluded with commitments that would echo across the centuries, as representatives of multiple civilizations pledged cooperation in the face of challenges that transcended the boundaries of individual societies or political systems. The alliance that had begun with the prevention of Erebus's corruption had evolved into something that approached the unity that visionary philosophers had dreamed of, but never dared hope to see realized. In the years that followed, as the Emperor's transcendence freed his consciousness to explore realms of existence that no mortal mind could comprehend, the Imperium continued to flourish under the collective guidance of Primarchs, who had learned to value cooperation over competition and knowledge over power. The galaxy became not just safer, but richer, as human creativity was unleashed through contact with civilizations whose different perspectives enhanced rather than threatened imperial culture. The chaos entities that dwelt in the warp's deepest regions continued to plot and scheme, their patience matched by malevolence that would never be entirely eliminated from the universe. Yet they faced opponents who understood their nature, who had developed weapons and techniques capable of countering their influence, who had created institutions dedicated to detecting and eliminating corruption before it could take root. The dream yet stood, stronger and more resilient than its architect had dared hope. Humanity had faced the darkness and emerged not just victorious but transformed, prepared for challenges that would test the character of their civilization for millennia to come. The galaxy stretched before them, vast and filled with wonders and dangers in equal measure. Yet for the first time in its history, human civilization approached that immensity, truly united, truly prepared, truly worthy of the inheritance that awaited among the stars. The future remained unwritten, but it would be authored by hands that had learned to work together rather than in isolation, by minds that had been enriched through cooperation rather than impoverished through competition. The greatest story in human history had only just begun, and its next chapters would be worthy of the foundation that had been laid through sacrifice, wisdom, and the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood forged in humanity's darkest hour. The Emperor's dream had become reality, and that reality would endure as long as stars burned in the endless night of space.